It's good to have you back. And we start with the first panel with two papers from Joanna and Magdalena and from Michal and Clara. And Stephanie kindly agreed to discuss the papers. Thank you for that. And you know the drill. So each of you has 20 minutes for the presentation. I think, Joanna, you will start, right? And Magdalena will also join you, right, in the presentation? No? You may take it off and you have 20 minutes. Off you go.
Okay. Sorry. Yes. "20 minutes from now, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I need to share the presentation. That's me who do it. Okay, wonderful. Okay, sure, no problem. Good morning, everyone. As you know, of course, but I wanted to say it once again, thank you very much for invitation. I really enjoyed this seminar, wonderfully. It's really great organized. Many thanks to everyone. And since I have 19 minutes from now, I'm going to start. I'm going to present a joint paper which has been prepared. I wouldn't say it's complete or it's done, but the purpose of the workshop is to discuss it. And we still have with Magda, my colleague Magdalena Góra, some issues to think of. The title of the paper is Importing, let me just move it. I don't know. Okay, like this.
It's not visible.
It's not visible. Importing differentiation to the EU's foreign and security policy. We want to look at the attempts of importing the differentiation by United States and Israel. Those two countries' strategies of increasing differentiation among the member states. In the paper, our main aim is to analyze the role of the third countries, but we are not focusing on any third country or any possible third country, but the allied countries. In facilitating the differentiation among the member states as regard to foreign policy. We posted two main questions. The first two questions are the questions why. I don't know why it's not they just disappeared from the presentation, but let me just tell you what kind of questions these are. So the first question why is why allied countries are interested in conceptualizing and then implementation of this importing differentiation strategies towards their allies in the European Union and in the European Union as an allied itself. And the second question why is a question why there are some countries within the European Union which are specifically sensitive to these strategies. What makes them so sensible to this kind of strategies, and what lessons the Union as an international player may learn from this. From answering of this question. Then we posted also three additional questions. What tools are utilized by allied third countries to implement the diversification strategy towards the EU and its foreign and security policy? Second, how the interactions between the allied third countries and the EU member states, bilateral and multilateral, but on sub-regional level, influence the EU foreign and security policy. And then third, what are the consequences for the EU foreign and security policy of successfully implemented differentiation strategy by the third countries, and what are the EU responses, or are there any EU responses? The two case studies we selected we owe you an explanation, because in the abstract we've sent, initially we thought to include also UK, but after we thought that UK because of many reasons is very different from Israel and United States. The main reason is that until very recent, UK was the member state. The second thing is importing of the differentiation strategy in case of UK is still not having like, let's say, substantial baggage of experiences which we could investigate. But in case of Israel and United States, it's definitely a case. Moreover, because Israel and United States since the very beginning of European integration has been considered, or there was a mutual understanding by both sides, the European communities and the European Union and Israel and United States, that there is between the parties a community of interest, that there is a community of values, that there are shared that the parties are referring also to this same set of principles in terms of working and organizing their activity in the international arena. On the other hand, our tentative study allowed us to decide that we want to concentrate and we want to focus on Eastern and Central European countries. There are, of course, many reasons for that, starting from the similarities stemming from geopolitical position and historical experience of those countries, shared needs and interests, which are, of course, somehow related to these similar geopolitical and historical experiences. And interests in regionalization processes, which are and a history in this, a history of or certain experiences in a regionalization processes, which are going or parallelly or beyond the EU framework. And for this specific study, we wanted to have a closer look on two regional initiatives. And these are, this is a Visegrad Group and 3Cs initiative. Since the workshop is about differentiated integration, and it has been said already a lot about differentiated integration, what it means, and since we are not necessarily or we are not, our main focus is not about differentiated integration per se, so this is not our main object, but differentiation integration we want to see as a result of importing of differentiation, as a consequence of a purposeful series of actions are undertaken by non-member states towards the individual member state or a group of states in order to spread the divergence among the member states, prevent or hinder obtaining the consensus, and in consequence impact the decision-making process in or with regard to foreign and security policy to achieve desirable results. So we assume that this strategy of importing this differentiation is purposeful. It is it aims to achieve a certain goals. It may not necessarily, it may be the only goal, it would be to spread the differentiation, but it can go even further. It may facilitate the redirectioning of the EU orientation or even fueling the EU position reorientation. So it can be also said that some these importing strategies would result with putting on the European Union foreign policy agenda externally defined and prioritized issue, which wouldn't be placed in the agenda if not these successfully implemented the differentiation strategies. Maybe this two more comments since the case study we are focusing in our paper refers to common foreign and security policy, where the contradictory preferences and interests are norm rather than exception. Applying differentiation integration will help us to explain the creation of like-minded groups within the EU foreign and security policy. So, but this this particular phenomenon we see rather as a consequence of implementation of the strategy by third countries. And the key that arises here, and the key question that is kind of a summary of the previously defined question, is how external actors utilizing the European differentiation integration and interdependence, this and interdependence can increase internal EU differentiation. Just to visualize our way of thinking, we have drawn this kind of graphic, which starts with the conceptualization of this strategy of importing differentiation. How this is being done, I will explain in a second. And the second move, or the second step, or the second stage phase of this of the process we are interested in is what happens when this strategy is already being implemented by the third countries, what it can, how it can, what kind of results may occur. So one of the results can be a contestation of European Union foreign policy inspired by the third countries. And the second one can be strengthening inner regionalization within the EU. What we mean by inner regionalization is strengthening or even initiating new regional initiatives, which are to a certain extent institutionalized, but not necessarily. In both of our cases, 3Cs Initiative and Visegrad Group are not organization in traditional legal sense. They do not have legal personality. However, they have already, especially Visegrad Group, a long-standing tradition of action. So what it can cause, this contestation and strengthening inner regionalization, is a growing divergence within the EU and EU member states and within the EU itself, a lack of consensus without which there is no actually foreign policy, and inability to effectively implement foreign and security policy objectives. So simply EU is becoming less efficient or inefficient, or is becoming in some cases, like the case I wanted to move in a second, Israeli case, is becoming completely dysfunctional. However, there are some other opinions in the literature. We wanted to, to not overlook anything that might be important. We were thinking about the toolbox, how to investigate the strategies of importing the differentiation, both on the conceptual and operational level. So to this conceptual, let's say, part, we would include interests, norms, and ideas. And to this implementation level, we would include institutions quite broadly defined. These are legal and all kinds of legal and institutional developments. Institutional doesn't mean that it needs to have needs to be translated into a certain legal norms, but it can be more frequent, institutionalized cooperation within, let's say, meetings that are happening on regular basis with a certain agenda. And finally, to this, let's say, operational part, we included also certain behaviors. On the left side of our table, we have the standards adopted by the EU, to which EU is which EU declares these are the standards that you want not only to follow in own foreign and security policy, or basically, but it also wants to import it through the Europeanization, which is by Schimmel Fanning recalled here a couple of times, termed Europeanization beyond Europe. On the right side, we have a column with basic characteristic of imported standards. So on one hand, to summarize, without going into details, we would have a preference of multilateralism, liberal democracy, normative-based approach, consensus in consensus-based culture present in the European Union. On the other hand, on the other side, these imported standards are very much, I would say, defined in terms of realist vision of international relations, where the multilateralism is more replaced by bilateralization or unilateralization of relation, where instead of liberal democracy, we have actually a contestation of liberalism, where instead of normative-based approach, we would rather have a power-based approach, an interest-based approach. So now let's go to Israel as our case. In short, to leave some space for Magda case and for conclusions, let me just say that Israel is, of course, having a very long history of relations with European communities. One could say that the relations between Israel and European communities started almost immediately when the European communities has been established, and it was then more formalized, and the framework for the cooperation allowed now to say that Israel is enjoying absolutely privileged position in relations with the European Union comparing to other neighborhood countries. Israel is to great extent integrated with the European Union. Just to mention the fact that Israel since 1996 is a part of, is the only non-European country fully associated with the framework, European Union framework program on innovation, on research. And this is a crucial issue, and I would like to refer to it quite once again in a second. Israel is enjoying, is benefiting a lot in terms of economy with privileged relation with the European Union. But on the other side, Israel is being for years, for decades, criticized by the European communities and then by the European Union for its policy towards Palestinians. The escalation of this criticism can be definitely observed in past, let's say, past years, and this criticism has to do much with the way how Israel, under the long premiership of Benjamin Netanyahu, was approaching the problem of Middle Eastern peace process, which actually, ever since Netanyahu was a prime minister, is frozen, but not even frozen, but is becoming less and less. There is a growing opinion, or that Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not anymore possible to be solved in a way as EU would wish to solve it. I mean, the two-state solution is not anymore realistic. Why? Because of, for example, very extensive settlement policy of Israel in the West Bank, in the occupied territories. So European Union was trying to, using their conditionality strategy, was trying to make or impose some pressure on Israel to like in any other case of conditionality strategy or policy, to give more for more. But Israel constantly was playing a quite efficient game with the European Union. And for this game, it's not like a simple game, but it's a quite sophisticated game. In maybe to conclude a little bit, quite recently, Israel, since I would say 2004, but under Netanyahu, this strategy has been really developed to a great extent of dividing member states into those who may support and are willing to see Israel beyond the conflict, and into those who are simply, as called by Israelis, are anti-Israeli or fundamentally anti-Israeli. Among those who are willing to see the Israel beyond the conflict, this is not my frame, this is not the, let's say, my term, but it's a term used by Israeli diplomat with whom I talked 2 years ago. There were Central Eastern European states. Why it is so? Because Israelis were clear that they see Central Eastern European states, Visegrad states, as states who would share their sense of understanding the dynamic of international relation, where threat from the neighbors is not something that happened in the past and will never happen again. The Israelis believed that because of the shared history, Jewish Central Eastern European history, this country would be willing to support Israel more than the others, and they were actually right. There are many examples. I will not recall them, but I will just group them into sections. What the one is how the proving that Central Eastern European states, the Visegrad states, were not only willing, but even supported Israel in voting on international fora, including European Union institutions, but also were willing to go even further. For example, by blocking any action taken by the European Union. Yes, Magda?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't hear you now. My interest in the case presented here, the US, is stemming from a broader research scheme about the external perceptions of the EU foreign policy that I'm researching since 2016, and based on document review and interviews that I've conducted. And obviously, the 3C initiative is a quite interesting case within that broader perspective. Specifically, that it was picked up quite clearly by the Donald Trump administration and sort of prioritized. So 3C's initiative, as you can read in our paper, I'll just spare the too many detailed background information. The 3C's initiative is gathering Central and Eastern European countries since 2014, and is primarily economy and infrastructure, energy-driven initiative, but it has also quite important strategic and security ramifications to it. And the US, from the onset of the Trump administration, gave a lot of attention to that initiative. And my understanding of the tools that we sort of conceptualize as in order to capture the strategies shows that there is a very strong interest-driven interest, as seen from the US primarily for the previous administration, but obviously there are also some hints that can be taken from the new administration position, particularly from the Secretary of State Blinken's address to the recent summit of the TSI. So what is interesting in the interest-based perceptions is that TSI was often presented as a compatible with overall US interest and strategic aims in the region, very much in connection to the prevention and combating Chinese and Russian advances on international arena and in the region. So it was viewed as a kind of initiative supportive for the overall US strategy, global strategy, but it's also a kind of continuation, if you see in this sort of singling out the new member states, something that that draws to the famous and quite divisive, if you wish, remarks by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in the eve of the Iraq campaign in 2003. So this interest is quite clear, and from here, if you look at the sort of as we decided to sort of maybe more link the interests and norms and ideas, that I'll just now comment on the bottom part of the table presented here in our slides, is that the very sort of explicit references to different norms and ideas is quite quite concealed in the data that I analyze. I think in quite different way than in the Israeli case, at least under Netanyahu. However, there is, especially in the previous administration, this sort of insistence of dividing member states and stressing the incompatibility of the interests that you can see in the references to 3C, and also the use of the Nord Stream 2 case, because obviously, as you know, the Nord Stream 2 was faced with a harsh criticism from Washington, obviously ended up in a agreement that came to the surprise of many Central Eastern European commentators under the current American administration. But the sort of the 3C initiative was presented as a different take on cooperation within the EU than the Nord Stream 2 being presented as a clearly sort of national interest against the unity initiative. And obviously, so this kind of process shows us that there is also this this game on the normative level that was played out in the American attempt to push for or support the TSI. Also, we cannot pass the fact that the TSI was a Polish-Croatian initiative, and it's one of the Polish key foreign policy initiatives under the current government. So there was this story behind the support for the 3C initiative, which was the enabling effect for those member states, particularly Poland and Hungary, that were perceived within the EU as backsliding on democratic standards, illiberalizing, and so on and so on. And on institutional and behavior level, I'll just try to be very brief because I know that we're extending the time. What is interesting is that on institutional level, you have this in the justifications given for the support of the TSI, you have this sort of play with the bilateral over multilateral dimension particularly, and this sort of idea of marginalizing the EU by the Trump administration. And obviously this is changing in the current administration, that can be clearly visible as sort of departing a little bit from this. But still, there was a potential to fuel internal divisions that this initiative was helping, and the key mechanism here was this contrasting with the Nord Stream 2 project. And I'll stop here. I'll be happy to answer questions to the case study. Joanna, back to you.
Utilized or tools were utilized, thank you very much, by the third countries to implement the diversification strategy. First of all, were clear reference to the common interests. Second, reference to the shared values, but the way how the values were defined is very, very different from the values, from the way how the Brussels Center or the EU defines the values. I would just say that if the EU defines its values in liberal terms, then the Central Eastern European states, as Poland, Hungary, and United States under Trump, would define it like more, especially Israel, Poland, Hungary in the ethno-cultural terms. Nation is important, security of nation, a collective rather than individuals. Then in the interest in driving regionalization, alternative to EU integration, which could in a sense substitute the benefits from the EU integration. How the interactions between allied third countries and the EU member states influence the EU foreign and security policy. EU member states would transfer certain issue coming out from the agenda of bilateral relation with non-member states into the EU, into the framework. Interesting, maybe I'll just skip it, just add that in many interviews I conducted in the past and recently, the diplomats would say, Polish, Brussels would say that the Israeli diplomats are the most efficient in pursuing their agenda, even when the decision-making process is on. It's not public, it's not announced. They know whom to call, they will find the desk officer, they know how to inform their partners, co-partners in the union about their position. What are the consequences for the EU for the EU's foreign policy of implementation of the strategy? Departing from a consensus-seeking culture, difficulties in obtaining anonymity, inability to take an action, and simply inefficiency. And in the context of relations with Israel and this priority issue of Middle Eastern peace process, it's really clearly visible. And what are the possible EU responses? This is what I heard from the 2 weeks ago from some key external action service officers. Wait for a change. Now we can't do much. Emergence, but the other responses can be emergence new patterns of interaction in foreign affairs among member states, and this can be this somehow engaging or involving these cross-loading processes about which we talked yesterday. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you so much, both of you. And now I will ask Michal to present your paper and Clara's. And I understand that you will be the only speaker, right?
Yeah, Clara
Okay.
may give some comments at the end if she's deeply unhappy with what I say. Let's see. Okay, am I sharing the screen or not? No, I'm not. Okay, hi everyone. It's I think it became a practice in these talks, but I'm really glad to be here. I missed Florence. I missed seeing people, not on screen, but in real life. So I'm very happy to be here. Today, I'm presenting our paper that was jointly written with Clara Portela, and Clara is now, as you can see, in her home office. And unfortunately, she is one of those people who we meet only on Zoom. Our paper is about the differentiation and EU's role in global nuclear order. And I think slightly differently than many other papers in this project, we take a very deeply empirical look at things. And so I hope that that still fits somehow in the project. We start from the point of view that there is often an assumption of growing convergence among the member states and when it comes to foreign policy. And there is this assumption comes both from the treaties, but it also comes from the way how EU often talks and presents itself. So there is this expectation that member states are going to somehow grow closer together and converge. And within international governmental organizations, EU has this aspiration to act as a unitary actor or as unitary as possible. So we talked about earlier in this workshop, we talked about the statements that the EU puts forward in different international organizations. We talked about how the EU tries to influence agendas. And so this is an EU's attempt to somehow put forward a unitary phase. However, if you read some of the literature that has been recently published, and here we are looking, in our introduction, our paper, we look mainly at the work of Karen Smith, and either alone or with her co-authors. There has been these complaints that this convergence under the guise of Europeanization, that this has been arrested. And so that this has somehow stopped or even been reversed. And so we actually take that argument and we try to empirically study it by looking at the role of EU in the global nuclear order. And we look at the role of EU's role in global nuclear order because this is the type of setting where, if there actually is any arresting of Europeanization, this is a setting where you should be seeing it first, because there is a lot of arguments and literature out there that says if there is one area where Europeans really disagree on, it's nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, for reasons that I'm happy to go through in the discussion. And so our point is basically, do we see any sort of arresting of this convergence? And if yes, how should we contextualize it? Now, to put this in a little bit of a context, EU's role in the global nuclear order or global nuclear regime has strengthened in 1990s when France entered into the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it takes shape through regular coordination meetings at the UN General Assembly, but also through the tools that the EU has to act in global governance, such as agreed statements, common working papers, through issuing CFSP priorities, and also through EU's activity at these conferences and in UN General Assembly settings. In addition to the activity that the EU has, the EU member states as such are also members of different partially overlapping groupings, and the EU acts, and EU member states act through these groupings. And in the early days, so in 1990s and early 2000s, EU was often dubbed to be the laboratory of consensus, because you have so many different countries with so many different preferences. The argument was, if EU can agree on something, then everybody can get on board. Whereas in more recent years, especially given the global developments with the introduction of Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, this EU consensus is somehow being broken apart. And whether the EU's role in the global, you can definitely see the difference in how the EU's role is changing depending on whether you look at the EU's role very formalistically, and this formalistic reading is how many statements EU does and so on and so forth, or whether you're actually looking at it substantively in terms of how much EU can actually agree on. Scholars reach different conclusions about whether the EU's role is getting better or worse. Now, what we do is we sort of take the literature on differentiation and differentiated integration, and we sort of conceptualize 4 scenarios. I'm guilty as charged of what Philip Genschel yesterday said, engaging in a mouthful of concepts. We are guilty as charged because this is part of it, and that Clara took lead on. And we sort of conceptualize these four roles. And we sort of start with talking about differentiated integration. Then we understand of integration of distinct groupings of member states along. Differentiated integration basically leads to member states sort of coming in different groupings, but then converging around these groupings. We also talk about the role of differentiation, which basically talks about EU member states sort of growing apart, but not necessarily grouping in distinct groupings. We talk about distinct integration as being a scenario where member states would sort of after a period of integration, they would sort of start to peel off from this integrated and joint outcome. And then last but not least, we talk about de-Europeanization, being also this process when member states are slowly leaving the EU consensus. And if you have conceptual questions about this, as I said, Clara is the person who wrote masterfully this section of the paper. So I'll leave her the floor at the end to talk about it. And we actually, rather than sort of cherry pick our data, what we do is we threw ourselves at the EU's activity in two settings, and we look at the EU's activity in the UN General Assembly, where we look at the voting that takes place on UN General Assembly resolutions that are related to all things related to nuclear weapons. So we use the data from Eric Footen's database, and very handily, Eric actually estimated ideal points for all the UN General Assembly member states on all the issues. So we can actually take these ideal points and we can use them in our analysis. And we then look at the voting on contentious resolutions that are repeated every year. So one of the great features of the UN General Assembly is that there are some of the resolutions that are voted on every year. And so we can look at how the EU is faring on these resolutions and whether there is any change. The second thing is we look at the different settings, which is MPT review conferences, which are taking place every 5 years, and when member states sort of come together to assess the health of the global non-proliferation regime. And we look at, there is no voting there, so we cannot look at the voting records, but the member states sort of put forward their ideas in this setting in working papers. So what we look at is the co-sponsorship of voting in these, co-sponsorship of these working papers in the in this setting. I prepared a few images with some fancy graphs, and I'll start with this one, which is the ideal points of individual member states. Is it me who is making that weird sound? I feel now sorry for my students if that's my voice. Okay, so what we see here is the ideals. Okay, excellent. We'll then unmute you at the end. So what we start is these ideal points of individual member states, and ideal points come from a spatial voting theory, and it's basically a way how you take a bunch of votes, and from this bunch of votes you through mathematical magic you basically put people on a scale, that scale, and then from the distance between states on that scale, you can sort of read out how far the policy positions are. I'm happy to talk about this in detail in the Q&A, but we don't need to understand that. One of the things that you need to understand this moment is basically the further away the countries are on in their ideal points, the further away their policy preferences are. And one of the things that you see here, and I'll use this thing, and you can see this here, is that when we look at starting from 2000s, there was basically a bunch of member states that were sort of in the middle. And here you see the two countries which are the nuclear weapon states, the two countries in the EU that have nuclear weapons. Well, by now only one, but at that time still two, was France and the UK. They're a little bit away. And then you have these part of member states who are and the neutral countries, and you see them here on the bottom. And so you see basically these three groups, and this what the Dutch call the thick middle, and you see the nuclear weapon states and these neutral countries. And what you see over time is that basically these nuclear weapon states are becoming closer and closer to the rest of the EU, whereas this group of non-aligned and these neutral countries, they are sort of becoming further and further away from the EU. So this is a first identification that there is, on one hand, there is some sort of a convergence, but then on the other hand, there is also differentiation between these individual member states. And there is at least one group that is sort of going away from the rest. Those are especially the neutral countries. Now, the second thing that we did is this is a super nerdy thing, but one of the way how you can measure the spread of data. So basically how much is this data spread is to look at the kurtosis of the data. And kurtosis is basically measure if you have the distribution of a point, then the kurtosis is a measure of how close or far the distribution is from the normal distribution. And basically, in this measure, the kurtosis above 1 means that it's it's sort of becoming flatter, so the distribution is larger, the tails are longer, and distribution below zero, sorry, not 1, 0. Distribution below zero means that it's thinner, so the tails are shorter. In other words, above 0, member states are further apart. Below 0, they become more closely together. And one of the things you actually see is that since 2015, the member states are actually coming closely together with one another. Now, even with a kurtosis of 2, it's still sort of pretty okay. If this was a quantitative analysis, nobody would care because this is still a pretty good result. But what we show here is that actually over time, member states are not coming further away from one another, but they are actually coming closer to one another, at least in this measure. The second thing that we did, as I mentioned, is we looked at the voting on these nuclear resolutions. And in assessing voting, we use a measure that is developed by Simon Hicks, which is called agreement index. And agreement index is basically doesn't measure how many people vote in favor or not. It only measures how divided people are on voting. And again, agreement index of 1 means everybody votes in the same way. Agreement index of 0 means that the legislators or whoever votes are basically perfectly divided among all the options that are on the table. And one of the things, that you see is that you have these repeated resolutions, and there is some of them where there are precipitous drops in the agreement of the member states, and there are others where you actually see that these votes don't change too much. And what we do is we basically take a look at these resolutions where we see these precipitous drops. So one of them is, for example, the resolution on accelerating disarmament commitments. And this is an interesting resolution because there is this period of time when almost all the member states vote in favor of it. And then in 2015, the resolution adds a language that delegitimizes nuclear weapons. And basically in 2016, it adds some further language. And what happens is that basically all the member states peel off and they become either abstain or vote against. The other resolution that you may find interesting is the resolution on nuclear weapon-free Southern Hemisphere, really technical issue. Almost no EU member state was opposed to it. UK and France were usually would abstain, but all the 26 other member states would vote in favor. 2017, there is a line added that says member states welcome the adoption of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the whole consensus sort of falls apart and member states move away. Now, we also, as I said, we use also the second measure of looking at the EU's activity, which is the co-sponsorship in the NPT review setting. And what we do is we measure how many of these working papers that member states propose are in cooperation with other EU member states, and how many of them are actually supported only by the EU. So how many of them are actually the EU working papers? And what you see is that for most of the member states, actually the activity in this NPT review setting is either activity with other member states or actually the activity that is put forward by member states. So what we find out is that about half of the activity that EU member states have in the NPT review setting are the EU working papers, and the working papers are put forward by the EU. And about 90% is actually activity with other EU member states. So it's a pretty Europeanized activity. So I'm not going to bore you to death with other figures, but what we basically find in the end is that the differences between member states, when you look at voting, the differences between member states are decreasing, but we also noticed that there is this crystallization of two groups. And those are basically the groups that are a small group of neutral countries and everybody else. And when we look at the co-sponsorship, we actually find out that there are these groups of member states across different groupings and different coalitions. But actually for most EU member states, most of the activity takes place in these settings, either with other EU member states or on behalf of EU as such. So we do find evidence for some differentiation that we see, but we also find that these accounts, these pessimistic accounts that the EU integration or actorhood in this sphere has elapsed and has been arrested, we find that too pessimistic, and we actually find out that this is actually doing so much better than what the critics would have. And I promise that I will give Clara still the floor to have some last-minute remarks. So I'm now passing the floor to Clara, and she's. I'm looking forward to hearing from her.
Thank you very much, Michael. So thanks, of course, for making the whole presentation. There are perhaps just two things that I would like to add at this stage. I think that one of them is that our departing point is that there was a fracture in terms of convergence in the year 2015. And this has very much to do with the humanitarian initiative and the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that came about just 2 years later. So, particularly, the latest set of graphs confirms that there was a turning point in the year 2015. And the reason why we are looking at these possible theories that can explain the evolution that we have witnessed, particularly before and after this turning point of 2015, is that even though the CFSP only provides for coordination and it doesn't contemplate explicitly integration, there was an expectation that by putting together these mechanisms for regular systematic coordination in the framework of international fora, convergence would increase, and that this would pave the way for integration at a later stage. And what we find is clearly that this has not been confirmed. On the one hand, we find that there is more clustering, but at the same time, two groups have crystallized, with perhaps the only exception of Finland that has positioned itself in the middle of both groups. But basically, we have seen increasing convergence, but not towards a common position. We have actually witnessed increasing convergence towards the crystallization of two separate groups. So this is why we check how this fits with the concepts that are around. But also perhaps something that is useful to mention is that yesterday, the presentation that was made in the first panel by Stefan and Ili actually quite speaks to our paper, because it introduces a new concept that we could use in our catalog, and that perhaps would also be a good fit. So, we look forward to the development of that paper, and perhaps this is something that can be really linked to our argument. So thanks very much again, and we look forward to the discussion by Stephanie and also the debate later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for making me discuss these papers. Just maybe if I can say two points, more general points in the beginning. I really think, I told this to Maria Julia yesterday afternoon, you're sitting really on a gold mine of different kind of empirical and conceptual material here. And I think it's I don't envy you, I have to admit, to actually sieve through it and create some kind of vocabulary that everybody can use. And I just wanted to mention one small thing that Ken Abbott told me at one point when they wrote their edited volumes. They actually wrote a glossary of different concepts that they'd wanted everyone to use in their separate contributions. And maybe this is an idea also for you to also, like, there are different adjectives being put before differentiation. Then there are different kind of like integration, cooperation. I will introduce coordination as well as different aspects of what can be differentiated, right? So maybe this is an entry point to actually, so that everybody has a common vocabulary for the different contributions. And one more observation I wanted to share is that from what I've seen from the papers is that in terms of differentiation, some look at the speed of differentiation, the different objectives, the different practices, the different behavior. Sometimes it's understood as an unintended consequence, sometimes as a strategy or also an outcome, right? Sometimes as a conscious choice by several actors. So I wonder for you later, if you want to write the conceptual piece, whether that actually, these kind of observations could be used as scope conditions to observe different kind of outcomes next to actually looking at different policy domains. So I just wanted to, if you don't mind, given that I have to leave after this session, unfortunately, point this out. So let me turn to the two papers now that I enjoyed reading very much, especially because both of them kind of put the EU in their environment, institutional or with states, and that's something that I always liked working on. So immediately that sparked my interest. And I have a couple of questions to the two of you in general, and then I go into the different papers. So my first question, broader question to the two of you is, I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about how stable the different types of differentiation patterns are that you actually observe. And I ask this because both times in both papers, this outside option, cooperation, either with other states or cooperation coordination in different institutions, and hence the states who are part of these institutions and institutional environments seem to matter at least a bit. They might not be part of the full story, but they matter a little bit. And so if these outside options would change, right? So either if the governments, there's a turnover in governments for Joanna and Magdalena's paper, right? Would that change differentiation patterns within the EU as well, right? More closely allied, more differentiated. And Michal, for Clara, in your paper, I wonder whether, so you look at two outside options, institutional, are there more, will there be less, right? Will that also change the differentiation pattern that we observe within the EU? So in a way, another way of asking this question really is, what causes and sustains differentiation in both of your cases? And the second question I had was, and I have to read my notes and I wrote them fast and I cannot read it anymore, even though it's typed. Yeah, I'm just curious to hear, I guess that's a question I have for all the papers, and I'm not super familiar with the literature, I have to say this as well, but I'm wondering if the EU or EU institutions don't object that much to differentiation, right? Even if it's competitive at times, because one could argue like at least temporary competition can be good for an institution, right? I'm wondering what that means for the EU in general. Again, another way of asking this is, don't we expect more differentiation in foreign security policy in the first place, right? Given that there are less legal instruments, isn't like differentiation plus differences, and again, conceptual stretching maybe here, aren't they expected, right? This kind of, do we really think that convergence has to happen at all times? So these are my two broader questions to both papers. And now moving to Joanna and Magdalena's paper, which I really liked. I actually really enjoyed your table number one, and I find it bad, like, sorry that you didn't have the other table in the paper as well. But I very much appreciated how you actually were trying to think of different differentiation strategies, right? Which I think is actually an important contribution. But just as my personal reading is, maybe you could call them, actually, you could name these different strategies, right? Because right now, interest, institution, behavior, norm, ideas, these are not strategies. These are where, like, areas where you locate where the strategies are taking place. So maybe one way of revising this paper is giving these strategies certain names so we know exactly how they function. So for you, differentiation is both for strategy and an outcome, right? And as I just said, you mentioned several differentiation, or as I might call them, divide and rule strategies, right? And I'm wondering whether actually you can theoretically link more these different strategies to different outcomes. I mean, you say your outcomes are either it's strengthening cohesion within the EU or it's dividing, but can we think of more outcomes than that, given that you have a set of strategies available? When I read your empirical analysis, admittedly, I was not completely sure in which direction basically the causal arrow went, or what influences whom. So when I was reading your paper, at times at least, I felt as if the US and Israel don't divide and rule the EU, but the existing divisions within the EU, right, have just like looked at outside options to then cooperate based on the existing preferences they have, right? So in that sense, I would like to hear a little bit more whether the US and Israel really can and have the ability to push and increase differentiation, or whether just them being there as different allies for states is an outside option for, say, Poland or other countries to go to do much more what they want to do anyway. I also would like to hear a bit more about the existing bilateral relationships between not only Eastern and Central European countries, but the European countries in general, right? Because all of these countries have existing strong bilateral relationships with especially the US, but also Israel. And so does that not also already has to be taken at point one, right? At T0, and not only at T1. Which also leads me to my last question for this paper is what is the role of time here? Because in the paper you mentioned growing skepticism or rapprochement, right? So there are these kind of over time processes going on, but at least in terms of the data, I didn't see exactly how this changes over time. Turning to Michael's and Clara's paper, here I really was intrigued, and I very much liked the way you actually triangulated your data, right? I mean, I enjoyed reading this empirical strategy a lot, and I think it gives you lots of purchasing power for your argument. But I have a few comments as well. So on the one hand, I'm wondering whether you could just, it's a lame question, but I'll say it anyway, motivate your research question a little bit more, because as is, it asks like, where are we at now, right? What's the state of affairs? And I just would like to know, so why does it matter if we know whether it's differentiation, de-Europeanization? Can you give a bit more meat behind the question? I also think it would be great if you could spell out a little more clearly exactly the role the EU has in nuclear policy, because so you use the concept of differentiated integration to a certain degree, and then differentiation, et cetera, but as we've heard already by Eli and Stefan, and I mean, there is a literature on differentiated cooperation out there already, right? We can think about it in different ways. So not only was I wondering exactly whether we look at integration, which I doubt, not only do I wonder whether we look at differentiated cooperation, which I'd like to hear more about, but could we also talk about differentiated coordination, which is something the paper actually emphasizes, right? So there are more coordination mechanisms. And I mean, this also arguably impacts the baseline from which we judge development over time, right? So when reading the paper, I also was wondering, and here I have to confess my own biases, of course, if we substitute EU with NATO in the paper, right? So we get rid of the neutrals. So we don't have these particular two groups anymore, but obviously we have the US, Canada, Turkey, so there might be another second group emerging. But if we substitute the EU for NATO, what do we observe? I mean, differentiated integration, differentiation, whatever the phenomenon at heart is not EU specific, should be happening within every organization. So I'm just wondering whether you could add data also on NATO member states. And I asked this also for several reasons. I mean, first of all, in general, I think you can actually build up this kind of frame in the paper about interinstitutional dynamics. First of all, I mean, I'm happy to point you to work, but I'm sure you know it already. But not only this, I mean, I'm also wondering whether actually lots of the explaining is happening in NATO and not in the EU from what you're observing, right? So I think it would be important to see how the EU and NATO compare. And not only NATO, I mean, as you say it yourself, UNGA seems to be driving also parts of your results, right? If language is changed within the UN, it's not EU proposals to do this, it's the UN in general, or like other UNGA member states who are doing this. It seems that this kind of outside option, this is hence my bigger question in the beginning, seems to be driving also what's going on within the EU. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about this in terms of theory, of theoretical development, and then also empirically by looking at NATO as well. I hope, sorry, I wrote this long paragraph and I hope this was more or less what I wanted to say to this point. Then just two minor points. I'm not sure this discussion of de-Europeanization does you a big favor in the paper, because at least how you operationalize the Europeanization and disintegration is very alike. So I'm, for the purpose of the paper, personally, I would recommend you to go for one and not the other one. And I mean, I personally have also a little bit of an issue with the Europeanization literature, because as you point out, it's mainly about, we have to observe renationalization to talk about de-Europeanization. But again, talking about now outside options, I mean, you can also de-Europeanize and NATOize, union, whatever. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about Europeanization. So, but that's just about the literature in general. And a tiny other question I like to hear something about is whether the voting in UNGA actually is a good proxy for differentiated integration or differentiation in general. And that goes back to a question that Thomas asked yesterday. I want to say last week, we've not been here that long together. And that's like, so what are the stakes and the costs involved in all of this voting going on at UNGA? That's it.
A lot of great questions. And I think we start with Joanna and Magdalena.
Magda, would you like to start? I'm happy to start, but
I'm happy to start. Thank you very much for very great comments and a lot of food for thoughts. And I will sort of start maybe with addressing to first general points about the stability of differentiation. And one important point to make is that I think together with Sergio Fabrini and maybe some other people, but I don't think so, we sort of work together within a project on differentiation. I think Maria Julia, of course, right? Because this is how we've met initially, which understands differentiation in a much broader sense than only differentiated integration.
Magda, we don't hear you. Maybe you could turn your video off. I don't know whether this could help.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now, yes.
No.
Maybe you can turn off your video. Maybe it's going to help. In order not to waste the time, maybe what Magda will.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you try to continue?
Anyways, okay. Anyways, so I don't know when. Yes, I am.
I'll maybe we'll continue.
I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Magda, maybe we'll try.
Maybe Anna, you can go, and I'll just try to switch to my phone, which can be better.
Yeah. So of course these comments are great. Thank you very much for them. Thank you for the like I would say technical comments and more those. For example, the one that is very, I would find very valuable, linking different strategies to certain outcomes or naming them. This will definitely make our argument more like stronger and clear. Coming to the question about to what extent what causes this the sustainability or sustained the differentiation, and referring to what you said at the very end, how to what extent the bilateral relation between the third countries, as I understand, and the member states, certain member states play a role. Of course they play a role, and this of course refers, and this is something that we should try to include. Of course depends what will be the will of our editor and how much space will we have. It's all Not much, but that's true in case of Israel and Central European states. Israel, being aware of a certain conditions that were there in place much before, simply understand that the new dynamic in the European Union is something that is like a new driver, a new variable that can help Israel to achieve own goals. So what needs to be also taken into consideration in our empirical study is, of course, to what extent European political integration is attractive both to member states, because simply for some member states, Central Eastern European member states, when the European Union lost some of its attractiveness and efficiency in terms of the Eastern policy, security policy, and so on, they started to also search for the partners. And Israel has like additional partners beyond or outside the EU. And Israel has become a partner that has this partnership between Central Eastern European states and Israel needs to be seen in the lens of their relationship with United States, what may bring our two cases somehow together, to see the linkages between the United States case, Israel case, European Union, and the member states. But of course, what you said, we need to, I completely agree. Some work has been already done after sending you the paper. So we try also to structure a little bit the case studies. We already rework some these pieces on the, so they are more comparable. So restructure in the sense that we want to emphasize on the categories through which we want to analyze. Maybe Magda would like to add something. There are many things we will of course refer to. If I saw that Stephanie, you have your comments written, please. Yeah. Thank you very much. Magda?
I don't know if you can hear me now. I obviously have the problems with computer exactly when it shouldn't happen. Thank you. I can see the thumb up. So I don't know what Joanna said, so I'll just give what came to my mind listening to the comments is I think there is a very specific enabling effect that is particularly relevant for the allied importing strategies, because this is if you actually, and I was thinking that, and I listened to Thomas Christiansen paper on sort of focusing a little bit on China, is that there is a kind of overall assumption on the EU side that there is sort of an alignment of interest when you talk about the differentiation that is sort of imported by the allied countries. And obviously, even though our cases both included the administration in the US case and the premiership in the Israeli case that were sort of having any issues with Europe, but sort of seeing this case studies in a longer term also shows the role of a very dense network that is created between the allies. And I think, Stephanie, you pinpointed to the fact that we should give a little bit more light on the bilateral relations. And this is why we brought in the paper. It's something that is not yet developed, but I think it has a potential, which is the external differentiated integration concept, which means that there is a kind of this third country is linked with the either the group of countries of the EU overall with a dense network of a different policy connections. And this allows the allied countries also, which is seen definitely in the 3Cs initiative, sort of play out or jingle with
Magda, again, a connection problem with connections. Let's maybe move on.
Or the
Polish government.
Okay, Michal, over to you.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Stephanie for the comments. She told me at the beginning that she's not going to outdo Philip Genschel, but she can. Shall I continue?
Regimes, if you will, in order to import the different, maybe not more interesting, but so I think the potential of the EDFs.
I don't have rights to mute her. Okay, so I want to thank for the careful reading and for the great comments. I got an email from Clara that she wants to address some of the comments. I take fully on board these comments about concepts, and that's something that we are going to revisit in the paper, also in the view of the framing paper that will be put forward by the amazing editors of the special issue. The point about the voting, that's a fantastic, I know that Clara will pick up many of the other points. I want to pick up the point about voting, because this is your point about whether that actually is a sort of high stake thing. It comes down to the same criticism that people have about you in voting in general, like, why should we care? And the argument is often like, this is the way how states sort of put forward their preferences, right? So if you want to know what countries think about nuclear weapons, you're going to well, maybe one particular vote doesn't really matter, but then if you look at them in general, that pattern that emerges does matter. And so I think the beauty of why we look at the UN voting is because in aggregate, it actually tells us pretty good where the preferences of member states are. So this is also one of the reasons why we chose here. And even though we look, for example, at this voting at individual resolutions, it comes down to that we actually find some patterns in variation that we observe. And I know that Clara wants to address other points, so I'll leave the floor.
Can I just jump in that for a second?
Sure.
So why is preferences driving different? I mean, why is differentiation equated with preferences? So it goes back to my early comment of, right? I mean, it's speed, but I mean, we look at different types of differentiation. So now it's differentiation of preferences.
I almost am going to say yes, but I'm hesitant because I'm afraid that it's an incorrect answer.
But it strikes me as then it's very unstable, right? If we believe that domestic politics plays a role, we both work on party politics, right? And parties change preferences over time, then the differentiation should be super volatile.
So that's the fantastic thing. It's not. But we can talk about that later.
Okay, thanks for passing me the floor, but I mean, perhaps I can make a comment that it relates directly to this point about the differentiation of preferences. I mean, basically, the objective of the coordination, the coordination meetings that the member states organize in the context of international fora, particularly, well, both at the UN General Assembly and at the NPT, is precisely to try to agree on a common position. They want to try to vote together. So every time that this is achieved, it is considered a triumph for the EU, because everybody managed to agree on common voting, while it is considered a failure when this doesn't happen. So this is basically what we were looking into, or the reason why we were focusing on voting, on the positioning and on voting preferences. But I think that going back to this suggestion by Stephanie about how stable these are and whether they might change as soon as there is a change of government in the member states, particularly in the key member states. I mean, basically what happened in 2015, or the reason why we are looking at this rupture, is because this 2015 turning point gave rise to the preparation of an international treaty. And we now have 3 member states that have signed and ratified that treaty on the prohibition on nuclear weapons, which runs counter directly to the strategy of NATO that sees nuclear weapons as being central to its strategy. So once a member state has signed and ratified the treaty, even if there is a change of government, it is unlikely that this will change. So this is basically what gave us the idea that we might be looking into patterns of differentiation that might be pretty permanent over time. But this also relates to one other point that I wanted to mention. I think that you have a fabulous suggestion, Stephanie, with this idea of looking at NATO, because basically NATO is the elephant in the room here. So basically we have the NATO umbrella countries that constitute this thick core that Michael was talking about. And what is interesting about these countries is that they have remained pretty stable. They have coordinated even more closely over time. And the nuclear powers, they have actually, the France and the UK, they have actually moved closer to this group rather than the other way around. And then you have this group of outliers, which are basically 4 countries. 3 of them are already full members of the TPNW. But I mean, of course, it would be very useful for our purposes to look also at what happens among NATO countries. So are we just seeing increasing convergence in NATO, which doesn't fit with the EU membership? Or is it useful to look at EU dynamics, or is this basically reflecting a dynamic that is taking place in NATO? Well, I think that this is something that would very much enrich our paper. And then the other thing that I also wanted to raise is this idea of, or the inclusion of de-Europeanization in our paper. Since we were since our intention was to check how this development fits with current concepts that are being discussed on the integration or differentiation. We also thought that it would be useful to look at de-Europeanization. But what is difficult here is to separate it in our operationalization from the notion of disintegration. And it would mean a lot of additional work to actually demonstrate first that Europeanization has taken place, because if we cannot demonstrate that Europeanization has happened, then how can we demonstrate that de-Europeanization is at play? So I mean, perhaps it would be useful to either drop it or to discuss these difficulties and connect it to the notion of disintegration, which is actually something that we can hardly tell apart on the basis of the data that we have. So thanks a lot again for your comments. I also think that I fully subscribe to this idea that the paper should spell out more clearly what is the role of the EU in nuclear weapons issues. This is also connected to what you mentioned about the role of NATO. Nuclear issues are actually not seen as an EU topic. They are seen as a topic for NATO. So the role that the EU has been trying to carve for itself in these issues is actually quite limited. So it is limited by the presence of NATO or the overlap with NATO. So thanks again, and back to Michael.
So if I can just, sorry, and then I will shut up, promise. But just as a very brief reaction, I think that would also, in my view, at least strengthen your paper. As you just said, Clara, so if there's lots of frustration within the EU, if they cannot coordinate on an issue, I think that would be great to show in the paper, right? To actually empirically demonstrate that the assumption is we want a common opinion, we want to vote together. And then if that is not happening, this is seen as a failure, right? So I think that could strengthen the paper.
Thank you so much for all these great questions, comments, and also answers. And now I will open the floor to more questions, more comments, and more challenges to the paper presenters. Ellie, go first.
Thanks a lot for the presentation of the 2 papers. I think they are really interesting. And now I have questions for the 2 papers. So I start maybe with Joanna and Magdalena. Actually, my question is quite close to a point that Stephanie made, because I wasn't sure, exactly what framing the discussion you have in terms of differentiation adds to just divide and rule strategy that Israel or the US can have towards the EU, how they can exacerbate differences between EU member states, and very, very simply put, I was missing a bit, what what speaking of that in terms of differentiation adds, you know, like how that's an interesting perspective, what we see that we wouldn't see just by speaking in very classical terms of, you know, divide and rule tactics. So I think that's so that's something, you know, that would be interesting to show, you know, what all those concepts adds to our understanding of those interactions. And then on the other paper also, yeah, I had noted comments also, again, very similar to Stephanie with respect to NATO, because I have the impression that in the end, if there is a bit of Europeanization within the EU with respect to nuclear weapons, it's due to the fact that actually just a very large portion of EU member states are also NATO members, and in the end, what you see is that the dividing line is between NATO members and non-NATO members in the EU, and in the end, the divide in the EU is just a reflection or a side effect of those different memberships, and for me the fact that's not really clear perhaps in the paper reflects a bit also how you define what's the global nuclear order, in the sense that for me you just focus on one hemisphere a bit of that, which is non-proliferation and disarmament, whereas there's the other half, which is nuclear deterrence, and that's also part of the nuclear order, I would say, and of course how EU member states are positioned in one part of this hemisphere, you know, what relationship they have with nuclear deterrent informs a bit their position with regard to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and actually you see that being exacerbated with the nuclear treaty ban. I think before you had maybe it was easier to have a kind of consensus between all EU member states, because, well, with the treaty on nuclear, with the NPT, there wasn't really this push to re-clarify, you know, where EU member states standed, because, well, nuclear disarmament is in the NPT, but it's a kind of long-term objective. But with the nuclear treaty ban, I think that has called a bit for clarification, and maybe that's why we see a bit this divergence or this arrested Europeanization. I would say so. I'd like to hear a bit what you think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks also from me for really two interesting papers. Three quick comments. One, maybe to echo also Stephanie's first point, which is sort of the challenge for the editors, because I think there are really amazing connections across the various papers. Obviously here, for example, between what Michael and Clara are doing with Stefan's paper yesterday, but also with Joanna and Magdalena, myself, maybe Maria Julia. But then the trick is also to not contradict one another or use concepts differently and so on. So I think in the introduction, perhaps a lot of care has to be taken to make these connections without emphasizing necessarily potential contradictions. On the two papers, I wanted to say to Joanna and Magdalena, I mean, this is very interesting. Obviously, I see the echo of 16+1 there. I just wonder what the difference is. I mean, you seem to emphasize, but I'm not sure how explicit you are. Sorry if I didn't manage to read the paper, but are you choosing these two cases because the US and Israel are officially partners of the EU? Is this the population from which you've picked the cases? And if so, what difference does that make? Would it not, for example, be more interesting to compare a partner interfering and importing differentiation, as you say, with a non-partner, with a potential rival, you know? Or if not, maybe you discuss at least what difference the partner means. And then I also wonder to some extent about the NATO dimension, because you seem to focus in the US case specifically on the Trump era and this particular 3Cs initiative. But is there not a much wider story about the US interfering systematically in European security from the very beginning, and to some extent having preferential partner security relations with some members more than others? So how special is this 3Cs initiative in this regard? And finally, there is a direct connection also to China, because the Chinese are allegedly interested in that. There's some sort of competition about the 3Cs between the US and China. So that might be also something where we can cross-reference one another. And again, I have a similar point to Michal and Clara about the voting. I mean, obviously, this is very analogous to what Stefan presented yesterday. And on the issue of concept stretching, I just wonder whether just voting the same way or voting in a different way qualifies as such as differentiated integration, because there is such a thing as diversity or divergence and so on. And maybe one should distinguish that clearly. I would rather say that differentiation somehow requires some sort of agreement among those participating to go a certain way, either forward or backwards or whatever. And I'm not sure if in the context of voting, that agreement, that prior agreement among the participants is necessarily there.
Thank you so much. Okay, but there are no more questions. Okay, then we will start with Magda, but I just use the mic to ask you, Magda, maybe to turn off the video, because we think that maybe the quality of the sound will be better, but now I don't see you anymore.
I already done, so.
Okay, perfect. So the floor is yours, Magda.
Switch the source of internet, so it should be better. And I'm sorry for the previous problems. Responding to Ellie's question, whether there is something new about the divide and rule strategies, I think there's an interesting case. I'm not sure about the Israel, and I think in that case there is some thinking on our side. But for the 3C initiative, and that sort of combines also the comments by Thomas, I think there is a quite interesting fact that the US is sort of investing in institutionalizing this cooperation. So there are investments in the special fund that the initiative has, and there is a presence of the US diplomats in almost every summit with sort of things like this. So I think there is an interesting point here to see that maybe the institutionalization is, and so as a result, the instance of differentiated integration in that case of 3C initiative is actually a sort of next step of understanding how to implement the divide and rule strategies, right? So that there is a very visible potential of the institutionalization of those instances, and that might shed some light into also the future developments. And so that's my first comment on this one. Yeah, and the second comment is to Thomas about the selection. We were actually inspired very much by observation of the Chinese strategies, and Russian for that matter, right? Whoever comes from Central and Eastern Europe sees these strategies implemented for a long time. But the Chinese are quite interesting. But what we, and maybe it is actually a good idea to compare the allied and sort of adversary strategies to see this, but we decided to go for the allied because we were also, again, and I'll repeat that because I don't know if you've heard that before, because one of the contexts that we thought are kind of interesting to see those strategies is really this context of the very close and multi-policy interdependence and sort of, which we understood as a sort of extended understanding of external differentiated integration, in which the third countries are actually participating in a variety of the sort of cooperation modes with the EU. And that was our sort of assumption to choose these cases, because we thought that both are having some aspects of this. So that's for me. Thank you again for all your comments and questions.
Briefly, to add to what Magda has said on a selection of the cases, I would also say that our time frame determined that we looked closely on Trump and Netanyahu leadership. With still, the United States and Israel has remained in the narrative a close allies. So the ally word, I mean, the term is very important here. But what we observed that these allied countries started to communicate with the European member states a completely different language. This is the language of realism, and Central Eastern European states were very they were very like for this kind of language and approach. So we thought that it's interesting, and what it might be also interesting to highlight in the paper, these countries were not chosen only because of all kinds of historical and geopolitical circumstances, but because of their importance in the EU. So they had a say in the EU, and since I would say Poland lost this quite relevant position in EU policymaking, Israel also lost interest in it. That's my case. So even not only lost interest, but decided to attack very harshly. So this is also proven by the interviews I made in Brussels. So Polish position is lowering, and the allies are not anymore that allied, are close. And yes, that's my comment.
Okay, thank you, Michał.
Okay, I'll try to be super quick because I know there is coffee getting cold outside. I want to be super quick, and I'll first address. I'll actually address both the points that were addressed by Eli and by Thomas. Eli's main point was basically, aren't we just seeing? Can we even talk about Europeanization or whatever EU sort of level of integration if this is only about NATO dynamic? And actually, EU had a lot of, if you look back into 90s and 2000s, EU had a lot of ambition to be active in this field, despite that variation. And perhaps that's something that we should need to make clear in the paper. But EU really wanted to be an actor on its own. So apart from NATO, because it was this laboratory of consensus. So I think this is something that we need to make much more clear in the paper. The second point that was pointed by Thomas, which is, which I put down in my notes as, does differentiation require an agreement and an agenda? And I think this is a very interesting conceptual question, but at the end of the day, it's really about what do we label things to be? So I throw that ball back to the editors because the way how, for example, Batra and Fossum think about this in their edit volume is they think about differentiation and differentiated integration. And the difference that they make is about whether they are coordinated or not. And so basically, if people just, their hearts grow apart, they think about that in terms of differentiation, whereas if they actually make a concerted effort to grow apart, then it's a differentiated integration. So I don't want to dismiss this by saying, oh, this is just about the labels, but I think this is a conceptual question. And I think we are going to be happy to take on board whatever agreement and consensus is built by the editors.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. I think we all got a lot of food for thought, not only for your particular papers, but I think also more generally from Stefanie and from Thomas and from Eli and from Clara as well and Magda. So thank you for that. Let's go and have coffee, and we reconvene in 15 minutes. So let's start the next panel at 11:30, okay? Hilke knows that, so I think we are gonna be fine with that. Thanks a lot.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome to our last panel of this amazing workshop, I shall say. We have a contribution from Benjamin Martial, and the contribution is titled European Defense Industrial Fragmentation as a Case of Differentiated Integration. And Benjamin, who is from the University of Edinburgh, has written the contribution together with Carmen Geber from the University of Edinburgh as well. And I'm particularly happy to welcome also Professor Sergio Fabrini and Professor Ilke Dirska here with us, who will be respectively presenting the concluding remarks of the workshop workshops and a comment by Iska in the end about the concluding remarks themselves. Okay, without further ado, I will now leave the floor to Benjamin. Benjamin, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and as Maria Julia's already said, this is a co-authored paper with Carmen Gedhard, my colleague from the University of Edinburgh, who sadly couldn't come and enjoy Florence with us, but is very keen also to discuss the feedback. And so the paper is titled European Defence Industrial Fragmentation as a Case of Differentiated Integration. It's a fairly drafty paper at this stage, and as I'm on the last panel, I've had the fun of hearing all of your amazing contributions and realizing that I wish I'd mentioned that somewhere in the paper. So hopefully that gives us a lot to talk about. So the background of the paper really is this sort of perennial idea that CSDP has usually been much more about security than it has been about defense. And that essentially it's been concerned with kind of on the operational side with missions that are much more focused on either provision of security in Europe's near abroad rather than continental defense, and that defense industrial cooperation has taken place at the level of the member states, and that the main defense actor in Europe is NATO. But of course, as we know, external events, the worsening international environment that we're often told about, which many of you have written about already, so I shan't list the problems we have in the world, as well as the withdrawal of the United Kingdom, have brought about a renewed focus on EU defence and on a host of initiatives, permanent structured cooperation, the EDF, and coordinated annual review of defence, which are explicitly aimed at making the EU more of a defence actor. So I think what we're aiming to do in this paper by talking about fragmentation and differentiation is really to challenge the idea that the EU is in itself becoming an actor which is sort of a distinct version of NATO in a way, or something approximating a more sort of state-like organization in defense. We do two things in the paper. We look at elements of what we call fragmentation in European defense as a kind of background, and then we look at sort of the ways in which EU defense initiatives have incorporated aspects of what we call differentiation as a result of this. And so there are three aspects we talk about in terms of fragmentation. One is in defense industrial terms. On the supply side, we have a very fragmented defense market in Europe. Efforts at consolidation in the 1990s were partially successful at best. We have very strong ties between the member states and now the non-member states and their pet firms, and high degrees of protectionism. And in many quarters of Europe, a focus on sort of defense as kind of industrial policy and jobs for skilled workers, rather than as concerns about the providing defense of the European continent or funding it more efficiently. On the demand side, we've had sort of perennial issues of joint procurement, both in terms of them taking place outside of the EU framework with coalitions of defense actors, high sort of dropout rates whenever problems have arisen in these, and also concerns about how successful these have been overall. The second aspect of fragmentation we talk about is divergence in national characteristics. And again, we can have a debate about whether that's sort of differentiation or otherwise. Here we distinguish between, I would say, kind of sectoral aspects of division. That's between the size of the defense industries between different countries, different levels of defense spending, different degrees of liberalization between different countries, and different, and as a product of that,
very differentiated sort of relationships between governments and firms. But then we also talk about aspects of strategic culture, which I think is also very relevant for questions of continental defense. The fact that European countries disagree on where the threats are coming from, have very different force postures and arrangements of their armed forces, disagree on the frameworks to be used for cooperation, and have big disagreements on the use of force, anywhere from sort of the French and British view on force projection through sort of German reluctance, and then the positions of neutral countries. And then the third element we talk about is we call multi-actorial complexity. That's the fact that you don't simply have one institutional actor involved in European security and defense. You have NATO as the predominant actor through which the defense and security of the European continent has been provided since the 1950s, and through which much of the standardization of armaments has taken place. You have non-coterminous memberships, of course, between NATO and the EU, and complex dynamics which individuals in this room have talked about in terms of division of labor between the EU and NATO, and potentially complementary but also conflicting dynamics. And then we have questions outside of the sort of EU-NATO relationship. The other element of complexity is, again, these the prevalence of sort of bilateral, multilateral, and minilateral relationships, both in terms of procurement, which I've talked about already, but also in terms on the operational side, things like the UK's Joint Expeditionary Force with the Nordic states, the Lancaster House Agreement between the UK and France, Macron's European Intervention Initiative, the recent Franco-Greek sort of pact, which came in the wake of the AUKUS announcement. And just this morning, as I was informed earlier by Thomas in the minibus, the crisis response force proposed by Germany and 4 other EU member states. So a very complex environment, further complicated by Brexit and the UK's decision to withdraw from the EU. So that's sort of setting the stage for what we call the European defence landscape. We then talk about some of the different ways in which EU initiatives have involved varying aspects of differentiation, which we see as really a response to this high degree of fragmentation, both in terms of the actors, the defence industrial landscape, and the frameworks available. So I'll just list these, and these really are in no particular order. There's clear aspects of selectivity in the membership and in the participation when it comes to PESCO, which, for example, even though we've gone for the broad format, excludes 2 member states. The second aspect we talk about is the emphasis on project-based coalitions, and the fact that not all member states contributing to PESCO across all of the projects. In fact, far from it. It's very much coalitions of member states around projects that they've selected, or their pet projects through which they work. The third aspect we talk about is the inherent voluntarism of many of these initiatives. Obviously, on the PESCO side, this voluntarism ends once you've signed up to PESCO and bound yourself into these projects, but there's still an element of voluntarism in sort of pushing forward your projects and selecting which ones you want to get involved in. With things like CARD, we saw a move towards a much more voluntarist, much less top-down offering. The fourth thing we talk about is distinct purposes of some of these projects. So, for example, I think this comes out well in that PESCO embodies both projects that would help to bring about a more independent EU defence posture, but also projects like military mobility, which would really basically contribute to existing NATO capabilities and could be used as part of this idea of a sort of single set of forces that can be put in service of different frameworks. We talk also, our fifth point, about the openness of some of these initiatives to third countries, and this was a big debate. Was it a year and a half ago when there was discussions about whether the UK could be involved in some of these projects, and so PESCO is the moment open to the participation of third countries. And then the sixth point we note is the parallel presence surrounding these initiatives of competing bilateral, unilateral, and NATO-based formats. And I think the most obvious example here is Macron's intervention initiative, which came out of the failure of the French position to basically push for this inclusive PESCO. So we don't, so we see this as part of a broader sort of landscape as well. The final part of our paper talks a little bit about these political and strategic implications of differentiation. We distinguish between political enablers, that it basically wouldn't be possible to move forward without making some of these decisions. That the hope would be that there's catch-up pressure to countries left behind or those that didn't get involved in many projects, but also the recognition of political realities and the role that NATO already plays. We suggest that there's also political risks as well. There's a potential, as with all aspects of differentiation, to have a stigma of non-participation, but also find yourself falling further behind rather than playing catch-up. As well as questions of fairness and equity when it comes to third country participation in EU schemes. Then we talk on the strategic side about the extent to which differentiation is a sort of strategic enabler. Clearly, it allows for a much more efficient division of labor and provides in so doing, and also through the potential for co-opting non-EU member states, provides for better European defense, and so can be seen, I think, as strategic in some sense, but also comes with, I think, strategic problems, including further complicating the relationship between the EU, NATO, and existing initiatives, risking a kind of lowest common denominator approach in which member states put forward projects they were going to work on anyway. I mean, binding yourself to something you were going to do anyway isn't really binding, and creates kinds of dependencies, particularly if in the future countries like the UK and Turkey end up becoming more involved in these areas. So I think, as I said, it's a work in progress, and we're hoping to think through how we use fragmentation and differentiation. And I might finish just by giving a couple of areas that we might like some feedback on. I think one area is really the kind of scope, conditions, and the concepts that we're using. We're not sure if this started out as defense industrial. I think it's gone a bit beyond that, and we're talking about bigger questions of security and defense. I'm not sure where we want our focus to be, and whether it's better to give an overview of what's involved, or whether it's better to hone in on specific areas. I'm not sure that in every respect fragmentation and differentiation capture precisely what we're talking about, and I think some of these issues have come up in the questions previously as well. You know, to my mind, I want to talk about the differences between the member states. I think it's important, but I'm also aware that every other policy area in the EU member states have their own disagreements, and we don't consider that differentiated integration. And then, of course, the question, and I noted earlier to Eli that every speaker has referenced his paper, so I'd like to as well. You know, is this integration or is this cooperation? That's something that's also going to be on our minds as well. And then whether another way of cutting it would be whether we're talking about, well, we're clearly talking about internal and external forms of differentiation, whether that should be the case or whether that simply means we've got two papers in here. And then it would be really helpful as well to hear comments on, and I suppose, the theoretical or conceptual contribution here. My worry is that we're in trying to be kind of analytical about identifying differentiation, how it works, that we're also risking being a bit more descriptive or not offering a kind of single exit argument. And I wonder if that's something we need to improve on. And it'd be good just to hear from you what, if anything, you found interesting about the paper, because that might be where we decide to focus on. So thank you very much. Carmen and I are really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. And thank you so much to Monica and Maria Julia for pulling this all together.
Many thanks for this presentation on industrial fragmentation. I will now pass the floor to Professor Fabbrini, Sergio Fabbrini, who will give his presentation online. And then after that, I will ask Ilke to kindly respond to Benjamin's paper and to Professor Fabbrini's presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for this invitation, and my congratulations to Maria Giulia and Monica for this very interesting and successful workshop. So I didn't have the chance to follow all the panels and to read deeply all the paper. I found this workshop very rich in terms of information and also in terms of concept. Indeed, I will focus, I changed the title of my presentation after following the debate. I will focus more on the concept of differentiation rather than on a specific analysis of the cases of differentiation in foreign policy. I will start from the Sartori alarm. Be careful on not stretching too much your concept, because otherwise you lose the object, the topic of your analysis. And then I will pass through the analysis of differentiation and integration in the EU, and then finally in the EU foreign and security policy to sum up some element of the institutional dilemma raised by differentiation. The danger, this is a classical Sartori word, the danger in using concept is to use the same concept for very different objects. And so you cannot explain apples with other kind of fruits, because each object needs a specific concept for being identified. And differentiated integration is one of those concepts. Is now a growing, burgeoning literature. There is an industry on differentiated integration where three projects, Horizon 2020 projects, are on differentiated integration. And at the same time, as a public philosophy is a declining public philosophy, not only Brexit, but from Brexit to the Polish Constitutional Tribunal decision of 10 days ago, there is a growing perception that differentiation is no longer able to be a viable political strategy or to answer to the challenges of the European Union. Probably the last moment in which differentiated integration was considered the public philosophy was the 2017 Rome Declaration for the anniversary of the European Union. So yeah, what is meant by differentiated integration? And is differentiated integration a concept good for all policy or for all regime? And of course, which is the case of your workshop, is the differentiated integration applicable to common and security policy? And again, I try to have a bird's eye view on the problem. And I think we have to raise continuously the question, which are the dilemma of differentiation. Consider all these research questions. I think the jury is still out. We don't have a clear understanding of differentiated integration. And there are very different approach. Indeed, there is a multiplicity of objectives close to differentiated integration. So we have to work more if we want to close this concept, and I think we have to arrive to some conclusion on this concept also, because in my view, is going to be less and less viable to influence the political behavior of political institutional actors. Let's start from, what do we mean for differentiated integration in the, let's say, mainstream literature? integration was traditionally understood as a supranationalization process. So there was since the very beginning, the idea that integration, European integration, meant and means the creation of a supranational organization. When we talk about supranational organization, we mean at least in that mainstream literature, both in particular functionalist or neo-functionalist, but also some element in liberal intergovernmentalism, we mean three basic properties. One is a transfer of competencies from the national level to the supranational level, and Bernias wrote a lot on that. The second is the building of administrative capability in Brussels at the center. And the third is the equilibrium between institutions in order to keep in some way the representation of member state government tamed, constrained within a supranational framework. So differentiated integration presupposes the process of supranationalization, where individual member states ask for being temporarily exempted from participating to specific measure of the single market acquis communautaire. So it was tailored the concept of integration and then differentiated integration to the market making process, to the Rome Treaty, basically. And in that specific interpretation, which is also was the predominant interpretation, the differentiated integration was justified by capacity lags. There are new member states entering the European community, entering the single market, needing to have time in order to build up their own capacity, to adapt to the acquis communautaire, to bring European legislation at the national level. And again, there is also a level of, let's say, of ideology in this concept of supranationalization, because supranationalization has been presented, especially to the new member state, as a kind of neutral, objective process. No member state is winning the process of supranationalization. Supranationalization is a way of keeping the member state on a fair relationship. This is not the case, because my caveat on supranational is that supranational has been largely conditioned and in a way influenced by the preferences, the culture, the administration of the stronger member states. So in a way, when we say, okay, there is a problem of building the capacity for adapting to supranationalization, indeed, in many cases, it meant also to give time to the member state to adapt to the predominant this configuration of supranationalization that in many cases reflected the culture, the interest of the larger and the stronger member state. But this is a caveat just to free supranationalism from the idea that is a sort of objective process. So in that case, differentiated integration was just, temporary capacity motivated. But there is also a second concept of differentiated integration that used to become very predominant after Maastricht. And in that case, the differentiated integration is motivated by sovereignty issue. And I say after Maastricht because after Maastricht, the European Union enter in fields, policy field that Philip and Marcus called core state power. So they enter very close to the core of member state sovereignty. And here we have the formation of let's say a second, or I don't know how to call it, logic of integration. If the market making is based on the idea of sharing power, this second logic of integration is more based on the idea of pooling power. And in a case, we have two logic that are going to be formed and then institutionalized in the European Union after Maastricht. So we have a differentiation integration number one, which is capability motivated. I need time, I need to set up my administration, I need to reorganize my political system and so forth in order to adapt to the supranational logic that we call acquis communautaire, but is the acquis communautaire largely determined, influenced by specific member state. And then we have differentiated integration number two, which is the differentiated integration intervening when the process of Europeanization arrives very close to core state power. And here we have the creation of the condition for a sovereignty-based division within the European Union. So the market integration passed through supranational governance, where the core state power passed through the intergovernmental governance. And when you talk about intergovernmental governance, you talk about something different from the traditional liberal intergovernmentalism approach, because intergovernmental governance is an institutionalized, or let's say institutionalized decision-making regime. It's not just the transfer of national preferences to the European level. However, this institutionalization has acquired a completely different feature than the institutionalization of the supranational governance regime. There is no a competence transfer, but also there is the transfer of the locus when member states discuss about their own competencies. There is no significant administrative apparatus construction, because basically the administration continue to be at the national level, because it is up to the national government to implement intergovernmental decision. And also the equilibrium between institutions has been altered. Here there is a more institutional hierarchy rather than institutional equilibrium as in the supranational governance. So in the supranational governance, what we are dealing with is a sort of functional or territorial centralization, and so differentiation is part of that process. I would say that the supranational governance is a sort of state logic without a state. And I think that many of the problems that we have today come from the fact that we, prisoner of the neo-functional approach, we did not completely envision the fact that we were building up a state in a market without having a state as a justification of the exercise of public authority. So, and here comes the difference with intergovernmental governance that I said before. It's more voluntary, it's more political, and so because of that, because it's political, it's voluntary, it's not based on legal framework, makes possible differentiation. So in a way, you might say that in order to have differentiation in the core state power, you need to have a preliminary differentiation in governance regime. So it's differentiation within differentiation. The other differentiation, capability-based, is temporary. Also, the distinction between directive and regulation might be an interesting seminar on that, is going that direction to help member states to adapt. Here, it's not temporary, it's politically motivated, it's sovereignty motivated, and it's a differentiation within differentiation. So much of the literature on differentiated integration has not, in my view, let's say, conceptualize the connection between intergovernmentalism as a new governance regime emerged in 1991 with the differentiated integration. Differentiated integration would not be possible without intergovernmentalism. So here we have a new, let's say, differentiated integration number two. However, this differentiated integration number 2 requires some form of institutionalization. And EMU and Schengen are a good example of that. However, this is a very interesting contribution of your workshop, coming from several papers, particularly from the paper to Jan Skora, that probably differentiated integration is not, let's say, the right for understanding, in this case, foreign security policy. They use, and as other people use, the concept of differentiated cooperation. There is a recent article by, I mentioned you, in which they raised this problem by Marco Sidi, Karyalian, and Jokela, in which they talk about the necessity of specifying differentiation in terms of cooperation rather than integration. And we have to discuss about the concept of integration, because integration is a sort of state, let's say, oriented approach. And in that sense, differentiated integration cannot capture the experience of the second and third pillar of the Maastricht Treaty. So differentiated cooperation seems to me a concept useful for understanding ad hoc policy developed outside the institutional framework of the European Union. Probably those ad hoc policy can be embedded in the institution, can refer to the institutional framework. However, they are outside it. There is no an institutional framework and the corresponding decision-making process for detecting the nature of those ad hoc policy. So what we had, it seems to me, and that emerged clearly from your workshop, is the growth of different forms of intergovernmentalism. We have integration without supranationalization, to use the concept that Uwe Poeter and I utilized for a journal of European integration special issue, in which you have the attempt to create institutions where to differentiate. So it was the differentiation will be the differentiation. But then you have cooperation, so you have differentiated cooperation, which is not a step forward towards more integration. Indeed, they are these policies, these ad hoc policies, these ad hoc intervention are non-integration. Full stop. Probably you can also raise the issue that they can, let's say, hinder the process of further integration. In a way, they can even foster a process of disintegration. So I would urge you to free your mind from a teleological perspective. All these initiatives, in a way, can be summed up in a new perspective of integration through differentiated foreign security policy. Some of those initiatives can also weaken, can also, say, makes integration in those fields much more difficult than assumed. So here I go to the case of the foreign security policy. You have a wonderful paper on that. I think there is a lot of material. If the editor can work a little bit on trying to homogenizing the language and, of course, the concept, you can give a very important contribution. But my let's say suggestion is to be more courageous, not to be within the classical mainstream approach to foreign security policy. So foreign security policy, of course, is goes straight to the sovereignty core of member states. If you talk about sovereignty, you have to talk about force, the use of force, and of course you go directly to foreign and security policy. So the answer given first in the Constitutional Treaty and then by the Lisbon Treaty was to find a way of institutionalize, let's say, the management of sovereignty-based issue like foreign policy within the framework of the European Union. So, and here come the various proposals of the PESCO, enhanced cooperation, and so forth. But if we have to say the truth, this differentiation integration number 2 was used very little. Even a few weeks ago, the European left Afghanistan, each one organizing his own, let's say, his own way of going back. There was no, even at that level, a sort of coordination between the European states involved in the Afghanistan crisis. So indeed, we have very little in terms of foreign policy. Probably is the most deluding experience of the European Union. We move forward in many cases, think about the pandemic, but there is one field in which the promises were very high. Somebody said that the Constitutional Convention of 2002-2003 was just for foreign policy, for creating a single voice, for giving the European Union a single representation in the world. And we are probably much less so now than we had in the period. Josep Borrell is much weaker than Solana. And instead of to go onward, we went backward. So in a way, differentiated cooperation has become the sort of governance surrogate of a non-existent EU foreign security policy. But how to account for a cooperation decided by single member states, in many cases according to their own specific interest, preferences, historical identity, and so forth. I think this question, this crucial question for understanding foreign policy is, again, without a significant answer. Of course, differentiated cooperation has helped to deal with the challenges and necessity. This is true. Through ad hoc policies and combination, configuration of states, in some way the voice of Europe arrived in places that were necessity to bring that voice. However, the differentiated cooperation has triggered the segmentation, to use Batora and John Eric Fossum interpretation of the EU. Has triggered the segmentation of the EU. And this segmentation, the formation of interstate coalition, regional coalition, section, is now becoming, in my view, one of the characterizing feature of the European Union. Even during the pandemic, in the 2020, we have 3 regions fighting each other. And now we have another formation of the region around rule of law, and the other against that region. So we have the gradual progressive segmentation of the European Union. And also we have the division between member states. We have directoire, in the Libyan case, free riders, and that does not help to integrate. It's not a way of saying, okay, this is a functional step in order to move on and creating the condition for integration. And probably we have to think about that concept of integration. And in many cases, probably those segments and those divisions can also be a step toward more disintegration of the European Union. So finally, the institutional implication of that discussion is, I want to just to put some pepper on the tail of your workshop. Intergovernmental governance means European Council, more European Council, and much less Commission, European Parliament, European Court of Justice. The the celebration of differentiated integration, which is not in the case, as I try to argue, that this celebration led to, let's say, the triumph of intergovernmental governance. Everybody is waiting today for understanding what the European Council will decide on energy, Poland, and so forth. So we have a political and not legal process of integration. Probably I was wondering whether we started since the very beginning with a wrong idea, concept of integration, and then at that point we also derive some negative implication of the process of integration, transforming the market in a state, or constitutionalizing the market as we constitutionalize fundamental rights. The second is that the European Council, which is the institution which made possible, or should have been made possible, the differentiated integration number 2, but more and more it is the European Council, the locus where differentiated cooperation is, let's say, in a way formalized, recognized, acknowledged, has become a collegial executive. So it's the states gathering Congress. But again, if we deal with the European Council, we need with the question of its own accountability. I don't think it's sufficient to go on with the classical granted view that the European Council is accountable because the member of the European Council are individually accountable to their own parliament. The European Council, if the European Council is a collegial executive, should be accountable as a collegial executive, not as a sum of the member of that institution. So we have differentiation within differentiation that generate other differentiation. And in that process, we are oblivious to the question of institutional accountability. And that is part of the, let's say, strategic weakness of the European Union. At that point, of course, we have to ask if the European Union is a union of states, as it is in market making, probably moving in the direction of centralization, also in area of the market making that are not necessarily to be centralized, or is an association of states, and which are, as it is in the case of the foreign and defense policy. So, and which are the relation between the EU as a union and the EU as an association. The impression is that the intergovernmentalization has increased dramatically the idea that the EU is an association of states more than a union of states. And of course, this is the question that we have to discuss on the Conference on the Future of Europe, but I don't see any serious attempt. Being member of the scientific committee of my government for the conference, I don't see any significant attempt to address this question. And okay, this is part of the reflection that I developed already in Eurofuture, the book I published a few years ago. And I think that we have to be very courageous in raising, let's say, not granted question. So thanks very much. Sorry, I spoke too much. And again, congratulations to Monica and Maria Giulia for the workshop.
Thank you very much for your kind words and for the presentation and for having pulled the strings of our 2 days of work, and also for having provided us with some additional inputs on our way forward. Indeed, there's, as Stephanie said, we're sitting on a gold mine, and now it's up to us to be able to actually get to it and make the most out of it. I will now pass the floor to Ilke without further ado, and Ilke will comment on Benjamin's paper and on Sergio's contribution. Thank you very much for being here, Ilke, with us today. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind invitation to essentially speak last after such an intensive workshop with so many bright people around the table. Unfortunately, I can't see all of you in Florence, but I'm sure that once we get to the Q&A, I can say hi, at least virtually, from Brussels. So the task for me is also a bit daunting because I haven't been able to be privy to all your intellectual discussions over the last 2 days, and I haven't had the opportunity to have a look at all the papers in depth. So undoubtedly, I'm going to be just repeating things that have been said. So bear with me on that. It's also quite daunting because I think that Professor Fabbrini has just very neatly summarized the state of differentiated integration theory and its applicability to EU foreign and security policy. So that on the one hand makes my life easier. On the other hand, it will be a challenge to provide some further additional insights. But let me first start with the paper by Benjamin and Carmen. You've provided just now a very nice summary of your paper where essentially you deal with 3 aspects: fragmentation of the EU defense landscape, differentiated integration in EU defense initiatives, and then I think thirdly, the most interesting bit of your paper, the discussion of some of the tensions that are there and that you highlight. Now, the way I read your paper is that your main argument is that differentiation in EU security and defense policy is considerable, it's significant, but we really can't understand it without reference to the underlying fragmentation of the defense landscape. So I think that's my take on your paper. What I very much like about your paper is the overall setup. And I think intellectually I agree with most of the points you make. I think your paper is also very beneficial for us in the security and defense community because of your critical take, I think, on a number of these initiatives. I think all too often we as academics go with the flow from Brussels about all the amazing EU defense initiatives that have been going out. And I think you provide a very nice balance there between a critical approach on those and then analyzing the way in which some of these initiatives do take us forward with regard to integration. And so with that being said, let me just make 3 points to push you a bit on the paper. You use the terminology, first of all, of fragmentation to describe the underlying landscape of EU defense. But I'm really wondering, and also following your presentation, whether this is not just the right term or whether it's an euphemism, simply that the state of EU defense across Europe is very poor. I think, just wanted to have said that. And I think that member state level is, I think, still missing in your paper. You made a number of points, but let me just repeat them. Apart from a few member states, defense spending is simply too low. And this is a discussion we've been having for essentially since the fall of the Berlin Wall, but certainly also since the Robert Gates speech in 2011 following the intervention in Libya here in Brussels at its goodbye. I mean, he was complaining about the lack of bullets and so forth. I don't think the state is a lot better, and I think Afghanistan also showed that. Then we've been talking about European strategic culture for a long time. The Macron initiative was also really geared towards, bringing a couple of countries close together on strategic culture. But we also have to face it. We are now 30 years after the end of the Berlin Wall, and we don't see very much convergence in regard to strategic culture. Then you mentioned that all the countries have their own defense industry, their pet projects, their narrow interest to defend. So I think overall, are we really talking about fragmentation, something that we could, address functionally with a bit of management structures, or are we talking about something more serious at the member state level? So I think that would be my first point where I want to push you a bit. The second point is then, and I think that relates to the position of the EU as an institution in the broader European defense landscape. You write under fragmentation that there are a whole range of different institutions, NATO, the EII, initiative by Macron, bilateral initiatives, Lancaster House, and so forth. And here I'm thinking, does it make sense to look at differentiation within EU defense, or is EU defense part of the differentiated approach within European security and defense more broadly? I mean, if you look at it from a member state's perspective, essentially member states like France, Germany, and others, they have multiple institutional frameworks through which they can cooperate, and the EU simply is one of them. They can work through PESCO, they can work through CART, they can work through NATO initiatives, they can work for bilateral initiatives. So if you move from, say, the EU defense to European defense and really, you know, consider the role of the member states, the institutional setup is no longer part of fragmentation, rather it's part of differentiation. So I think that's something you might want to think about, whether you should take a broader scope and think about European defense rather than EU defense, and consider EU defense as part of the fragmentation. Then finally, and I think you also asked for some input here, I'm just wondering whether you can strengthen further your innovation of the paper. There isn't much on the side of original data in your paper. It's really a review of what a number of other people have said, and you bring that cleverly together. But I think there are some interesting points you make in your discussion section, which you probably want to flesh out a bit more, and which probably also put limitations on the framework of differentiated integration in EU defense. But currently I had the impression that the discussion section towards the end was a bit short, somewhat a mix of theory and empirics, a large focus on PESCO, rather than, say, the whole spectrum of initiatives that you mentioned earlier. So I think that's really something that I'd like to see further developed, and where you can really make clear what you add to the broader literature. So I think those were three of my comments. I do realize that some of them are more type of external critique than an internal critique to your argument. But I think that's also partially because I tend to agree with the balance you create on the whole for EU defense policy. Moving on to the presentation by Professor Fabrini. I think this includes a number of very important thoughts on the project as a whole. It's also difficult to disagree with some of them. I found it quite helpful how you go back to some of the basic underlying assumptions of the theory, where it came from, and I think we need to keep these points in mind. So what I think I'm going to do here is not provide a critique on a critique, but rather discuss some of the more external validity of the project as I see it. I would say that Professor Fabrini provides an internal critique. He goes back to the concept of theories and see where things match. I'm essentially just wondering whether there are not a whole range of alternative conceptual approaches that might cover the same things. And precisely my question would then be also to the project organizers, where does differentiated integration fit? And I think this also comes from someone who was very much engaged with European studies, European integration theory for a long time, but has moved a bit more towards the IR perspectives, the international relations community, where I think some of the theories, are different, so to say. And I think one of the things from an IR broader perspective that amuses me a little bit is essentially the variety of NS1 type of theories that come up on European integration in the last decade or so. I mean, it has always been an issue, but the proliferation of different sorts of European integration theories is really quite something. And one wonders here whether you cannot get more purchase out of other established theories. And I think cooperation around integration, I think, was mentioned, but I think we can go a bit further. I already noted with the previous paper that should we really be focusing on the EU level, or can we think more broadly about differentiation? And when you think about foreign and security policy for the EU countries, for the EU member states, they have opportunities to go for the EU, NATO, UN, OSCE. They have the informal formats by Macron, the Normandy format, the P5+1 on Iran, the Balkan contact group. They can sometimes go unilaterally, as France does, and so forth. So it strikes me that countries, member states, have a lot of institutional choice, right? Now, there are a whole bunch of theories of international relations that deal with questions of institutional choice. So how does, say, institutional choice differ from differentiated integration? What does differentiated integration provide? At the same time, there is an even longer IR tradition in the field of regime complexity and institutional overlap, right? So there are many different sorts of regimes around, either within international organizations, around international organizations. There's a lot of work on institutional overlap. So precisely how does this fit? What I also noticed, and I think Professor Fabrini made a number of very important points along those lines, is differentiated integration is ultimately a very functional concept, and it's not very political. The politics is there simply because member states can't agree. You know, they agree that some member states can move forward. But it still means that it's about scale advantages that's driving differentiated integration, flexible membership, efficiency considerations, and so forth. And it ultimately results, and I think that was mentioned before as well, in a functional division of labor, right? So if you decide to be part of the Eurozone, which would be differentiated integration, I mean, yes, there are treaties, but not all member states are in. If you decide it simply means you're going to have to give up your own currency and you're going to have to live by the rulings of the European Central Bank. So it's division of labor. You cannot be part of the euro and have your own currency. A foreign policy doesn't quite work like that. There's no need division of labor. The member states have created the foreign security and defense policy, and they still have their own foreign policies. They have created the External Action Service, and none of the member states have closed their own bilateral embassies. So I think I've looked a bit myself into this concept, going to the term of non-exclusive delegation, which essentially runs counter to a lot of the functional type of explanations for why we delegate, why we integrate, and so forth. And I'm also wondering here whether, thinking a bit more about politics, about political power, particularly in areas of core state powers, such as foreign and security policy, would put some pressure on the overall concept of differentiated integration, which strikes me still as very much functional division of labor and so forth. So I think I'm just gonna stop there by throwing in a number of points and perhaps different theories. But I think what would be ultimately helpful is to consider, where does differentiated integration as a concept differ from some of the other established theories? What does it tell us about EU foreign and security policy that we did not already know? So where is the mileage? Where's the purchase you get from this concept? And I think that those are a number of external points that come on top of the excellent internal critique that was just presented by Professor Fabrini. So I'm going to stop there, and I am looking forward to the rest of the discussions.
Thank you, Ilke. Indeed, that was great. Great comments, great, and it also helped us to broaden up our perspective, which is indeed useful. I would now ask Ben to reply. And then after Ben, Professor Fabrini can reply if he wants to Ilke.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilke, for those very helpful, very detailed, and I think in some sense quite kind comments as well. So that's very nice of you. And I've also just figured out which camera to look at. So hi. So yeah, just a quick response to your comments. So I think I agree with everything you're saying in terms of fragmentation. I think you're right. My problem with the term, and it again comes back to the question of us starting the paper looking at defense industrial cooperation, then realizing that differentiation was involved in other broader aspects of defense, is that fragmentation as a term both has too many connotations with sort of the defense industrial landscape and previous terms used to describe that, but also doesn't seem to quite get at the significance of what's going on here. I think one problem we had also is that some of what we want to describe as fragmentation could also be described as differentiation, but we didn't want to overly complicate the picture and the two parts of the paper. So I think that's something we'll go back and work on. On the second comment, yes, I think we would agree as well that does it make sense to look at just the EU or the broader European architecture. I think our aim initially was to try to do a little bit of both, basically by looking at what had been said about EU initiatives and contextualizing that within the broader European security and defense landscape, which, coming back to your comments about our position being critical, I mean, in the UK, this wouldn't be essentially a critical position, but you know, maybe we can stylize that as our contribution. But you know, in the back of our minds is existing NATO initiatives and the ways in which EU initiatives are sort of open to or partly designed to fit around this, which I think can never be captured by some of the politics of this, right? Which is the sort of the references that you get in Brussels, but are also picked up in other corners to, you know, wow, isn't the EU moving forward in security and defense and becoming a security and defense actor? Yes, but also, as you said, part of this broader, more differentiated landscape, which has implications for the way that these initiatives develop, what they can do, what they can't do, and what they will and won't do. And then, yeah, I really appreciate the pointer on how we strengthen the original contribution. I think I sort of hedged in my own presentation that was something we're thinking about as well. You're right, of course, that in the final sections where we actually get into the interesting analysis, we talk mainly about PESCO, partly because I thought those were the more interesting dynamics, partly also because we simply didn't have time to go through all of the initiatives. But I think it makes a lot of sense, taking point your second comment, that we maybe think more broadly about this section as well and think about the ways in which our view of the sort of politics and the strategic implications of differentiation would apply to the European defense environment more broadly, but also thinking about the contribution made by everyone at this workshop, how we might incorporate some of the lessons that we've learned from the other papers as well, because we've learned a lot over the last 2 days about, I think, the politics of differentiation. And that sort of, and one point just not directly in response, I think, is one of the things that's really come up in this workshop is this question of whether it's all differentiation, whether it's cooperation, whether it's selectivity. And to my mind, what clearly in some respects we're moving away from the sort of ideal type of differentiated integration when we're talking about foreign security policy. But I think as well that there is a real cohesiveness to all of these conversations that we're having, because they focus on selectivity and differentiation and the political and strategic dynamics that come from that. So yeah, thank you very much, Ilka, for your comments. Much appreciated.
All right, thank you, Ben. Professor Fabbrini.
Thanks, Ilka. Very interesting. I will make very brief comment. Yes, the point of my, let's say, critical approach concern the limit of the functional interpretation of the European Union. The functional interpretation was very important. I don't want to let's say, underestimate the role of functional approach, but it seems to me that we arrive to a point in which, particularly in foreign policy, function is no longer able to give some interesting answer to our question. Function was the attempt to push politics out in the process of market making, and it worked. Of course, after the experience of the French Assemblée Nationale, you set up a system, an economic union without politics. It was an approach that in a way interpreted politics as a constraint and not as a resource. Now, that approach was unquestioned. And you had the outcome of this unquestioned view has been the creation of the transformation of the market in a sort of a state as minor. You know, there are 4 freedoms, and those 4 freedoms are, let's say, like the Bill of Rights. You cannot question those 4 freedoms because they are constituted of the union. So this approach introduced also the idea that Integration means institutionalization, to a certain extent, centralization, administrative capacity building, and so forth. This differentiated integration is a way of letting some member states to have their own time and let's say, in order to reach the avant-garde group. If you transfer this very concept in foreign policy, you run in a completely different direction. So in market making, functions generated a sort of quasi-state-like organization. In foreign policy, I don't want to enter in the third pillar, the question of, let's say, internal order, but in foreign security policy, the functional approach generates exactly the opposite. We have the attempt to institutionalize differentiation, but it couldn't work because that differentiation emerged since Maastricht concerned not capability issue, but sovereignty issue. And you cannot answer sovereignty division through a functional solution. Sovereignty issue required to be dealt with constitutional approach, not functional solution. So the reliance on the functionalism in foreign policy led to the demise of differentiated integration as institutionalization of different interests and preferences. So I said PESCO is basically non-existent. There is much more literature than facts. And also the other attempt to institutionalize differentiated integration did not work. At the same time, functionalists rely completely on what Maria Giulia called informal governance or ad hoc policy, leading groups, without questioning whether this differentiated cooperation, let's say like that, can be instrumental for increasing integration or exactly the opposite. And so now we are facing this serious problem. As Magda and her colleagues show, we were unable to write even down a document saying that the European Union want to have the peace between Israeli and the Palestinian and Hamas, because Orban vetoed that proposal by Josep Borrell. So we cannot even enter as a mediator in one of the most important conflicts in our neighborhood because of that segmentation. So I don't know the answer. We have to describe and to be very critical in our discussion. But my impression is that this segmentation can end up in a sort of paralysis of the European Union as an association of states. And it is, at that point, is inevitable to raise the issue. Is that association of states compatible with the state-like logic of the market, in which we cannot even leave UK to negotiate regarding the free circulation of individuals? So we cannot leave the UK to negotiate around the free circulation of individuals, but we can leave the member state to do what they want in foreign policy. How to put together these two sides? And my answer is functionally is unable to do that. And also liberal intergovernmentalism is unable to do that. So there is a lack of conceptualization in order to understand this moment of European Union experience. Okay, sorry, too long again, but.
No, thank you. Lots of food for thought, even in this panel, thanks. I will now open the floor to the public, in case you have any, I know you must be tired, but I mean, last effort. Any questions from the public? Please, Catherine, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben, for your paper that I very much enjoyed reading. And so many of my comments were already made more or less, so I will try to summarize or maybe just point out a few things. So I enjoyed reading your paper. I mean, you show very much that issues pertaining to differentiated integration apply well to the sector, broadly defined. I mean, it's very rich. You talk both about causes of differentiated integration and consequences. And I think maybe there will be a choice to make here, possibly, but I don't know. So my first comment was on fragmentation. Indeed, I think to me, when reading your paper, it felt like you use fragmentation as a way to describe the heterogeneity of the situation of states in matters of defense, which actually would have exactly the same in terms of migration, in terms of banking system, etc. So I'm not sure that in the context of a larger discussion between concepts such as differentiation, fragmentation, cooperation, I'm not sure that using fragmentation there is useful. And this leads me also to your, I mean, a point that you raised is whether differentiated integration captures most of what you're talking about or is relevant in that respect. And here I concur with what's already being said. I think that many points that you talk about could be described through different concepts. So to take some other concept that has been used and possibly, I mean, in a way to be cumulative somehow with other contributions, your paper could be framed as the tensions between differentiated integration and differentiated cooperation, or between differentiated integration and institutional complexity. Because obviously, I mean, Macron's initiative or Takuba now, I think, according to me, would be hard to capture through the concept of differentiated integration, in the sense that you have no, surely it's selective, etc., but you don't have any binding effect of those policies. They fall outside of the scope of the EU. And I mean, just the members, I mean, having Denmark as a force in Macron's initiative, but having opted out of CSDP really shows that there is something, I mean, I would say that having Denmark in so many other initiatives shows that it's not about EU integration, but it's about something else. So again, institutional complexity, I think, if you broaden the scope towards European security and not EU security, you see that complexity at stake. And that leads me to my last comment question. You talk, I mean, I think that the most interesting part indeed in your paper is about the tensions, right? Brought about by this, however we want to call it, disintegrated approach. And here I wonder, because you talk about political and strategic tensions, I wonder to what extent you would want to apply those criteria that have been used yesterday by other colleagues of legitimacy, accountability, and effectiveness, because I think it would maybe stretch out the variance in the tensions that you look at. And yeah, I think, I mean, I'm also interested in a question about the causes of this differentiation dynamics, but I'm not sure it's the core of your paper. But clearly you focus more on the military side, where I think that there are, well, but that's my bias, so you may not want to take that into account, but there are lots of industrial and economic interests that shape that a lot as well. But yeah, that's it. But thank you very much. And yeah, this differentiated integration as possibly a strategic enabler is also interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I very much like the idea of using the paper as a way to conceptualize differentiation vis-a-vis regime complexity, international regime complexity. That could be also a way of, in the end, if we come out with an argument, we need to discuss also the other arguments that are out there. And I think Ilke is totally right in this. Having said this, are there any other points from the public that want to be raised? Maybe raised? Thomas, I knew it. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben and Carmen. And maybe a couple of quick comments on the paper and also one that maybe links to what Sergio said last. I mean, I would echo the general feeling, but I think that's not specific to this paper. The overall conceptual conundrum is there. But it's not my field, so forgive me for potentially being ignorant. But I think what is in your paper is a number of parallel developments which don't necessarily all go in the same direction. This is also not a very original comment, but what I think is specific here is that from at some point being there nothing, we've had a degree of defense integration, which also includes I would say, surprising element of communitarization, if I may call it that. The role of the Commission having a role in defense, that this part becomes part of internal market policies, the European Defense Agency. These things are in your paper, obviously. I just wonder whether you're sort of pushing a square peg in a triangular shape when you describe this as differentiation, because there is differentiation going on clearly on all kinds of fronts, but there's also this community element, which is after all, fairly uniform in terms of involvement of member states. And indeed, that's the main point, the supranational institutions. So I just wonder whether instead of perceiving this as one large process, one should really look at two parallel processes, one of differentiation on the one hand, where things are fragmenting perhaps, and the other one which actually goes in the opposite direction. I don't know if that's ignorant, but I think I may be a bit optimistic there. There's also, I think, what Katalin said, I also wanted to say the sort of commercial dimension of defense cooperation among private firms. Now, we know that these are very close to the state, but one shouldn't maybe use them completely as proxies of states either, and the consortia that are being formed among firms maybe deserve some attention of their own. And that brings me to another point, which is Brexit. To some extent, things like Airbus and so on have been complicated by the British, having to be in there. But after Brexit, and perhaps especially after AUKUS, there is perhaps a new push for a European Union defense industry. I don't know, but this new fighter aircraft that I think the French and the Germans are cooking up is maybe a sign of that. And that's maybe a wider point, which reminds me of a question I was going to ask Michael actually and Clara on their paper, which is, did you not perceive in your paper a sort of increase in or decrease in the diversity after 2015? I just wonder whether the absence of the UK makes things easier in a way. I mean, there's less need in some respects for differentiation because the British are not there anymore, and they have been awkward on occasion. So one could maybe put a positive spin on things to say that after Brexit, under French leadership, perhaps it's more likely that there is a more uniform approach. All of which is probably marginal to the overall story of differentiation and so on, but one could perhaps, and that relates to the final point I was going to make to Sergio. I'm not sure I fully go along with this distinction between sovereignty and capability issues. I mean, I see the distinction. I think it's valuable, but I think we also have to recognize the interdependencies between them. So if we just take this example of defense, defense strikes us perhaps initially as a sovereignty issue. But if you then look at, standardization issues in procurement of weapons programs and so on, there are also a lot of functional issues there. And indeed, I think what the Commission and the agencies and so on are doing are actually functional integration. So I think issues are a bit more complex then falling either completely in one or the other camp of this big distinction. Just a thought. Thanks.
Anyone else? Maybe Ilke wants to follow up. I don't know whether he has anything to add. No? Okay. No, if there are no other questions, I would ask Ben to respond. And then maybe Professor Fabbrini as well, if he wants to respond to Thomas' points.
It's my go again. Right, let's do this. Okay, thank you so much, Catherine and Thomas, for those really helpful comments. And I'll start, Catherine, if I might, with your comments, and just say I'm really pleased that you were able to come back to the workshop and engage with this paper, and we found your own work on this really helpful. So it's really much appreciated. Just to say, to contextualize it, I agree with all of the comments, and some of them overlap with, I think, some of the concerns we had about the paper, but some of those comments were also very new and very helpful as well. It's a good point, I think, on the causes and consequences. Yes, we're clearly looking at both, and that relates again to this problem that we haven't got the neat framing at the beginning sorted. I think that there is a possibility that we can attend to both throughout the paper, but I think you're absolutely right to push us on this, because I think it'll make for a far neater structure and a much clearer sense of what the value add is if we know which one we think is more interesting, right? Otherwise, we're using different concepts and theories for different purposes. The most interesting thing I thought you said was this tensions between differentiated integration, the other concepts. I think that's really interesting. Yes, I agree. We're probably engaging with notions of institutional complexity, and I think you're right. It might be much more interesting to set that aside, the aspects of differentiated cooperation within EU initiatives, and see what the overall sort of result is. And I think we will also work towards looking at a much more sort of a broader European framing, and then looking at how the EU initiatives fit within that. I don't know why we didn't use legitimacy, accountability, and effectiveness. I think for the purposes of this paper, a lot of what we would have put in legitimacy and accountability would have been smaller sections, maybe. So maybe that's why we did it. And I think it's, so I'm struggling here, because if we adopt that tripartite system, then I think we're struggling to find a few more things to talk about in terms of accountability, because what we really want to talk about is political legitimacy. But then if we don't do that with our current distinction between politics and strategy, we miss other forms of effectiveness, which I think the tripartite structure would help more with, right? So it's quite clear that especially when we're talking about defense industrial collaboration, that cost is a big factor. There's economic efficiencies as well as strategic efficiencies, and you can reduce them to one another, but it's maybe less helpful. So those are really great comments. Thank you so much. Thomas, your comments are also great. Thank you. I think, so we are obviously aware of the sort of communitization element of this, and we're also aware of how, I think, sort of surprising it is. I think the reason that we've downplayed it in the paper is that in a sense, it wasn't something that we were arguing against, but I think we linked some of the existing literature, which is really focused on this kind of, new initiatives that were kind of enabled by Brexit, but also by the kind of events that were happening at the time, because they really are sort of transformative in some respect. And I think we thought that highlighting the communitization element was less surprising, because it had been said before by quite a bit of the literature, but also that part of our argument was sort of to challenge how transformative they have been. But I actually think maybe if we adopt a sort of broader approach, where we're talking about how EU initiatives fit within a sort of European security and defense landscape, then we can do a little bit more to bring that in and say, yes, we agree, this is transformative, this is really interesting, and how does it interact with the differentiated elements? So I think we'll go back, lots of stuff for us to think about there. And in terms of firms as proxies, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's a little bit of shorthand going on here, because that one page where we talk about demand and supply issues in relation to defense industrial cooperation, I mean, that's a huge literature on which many people in this room have written on it, and we we were struggling to find ways, I think, to do justice to that literature without falling into that trap of sort of saying, you know, all of the member states are the same, they all have their pet projects, and they're all very protectionist, or without sort of reducing it in a kind of, in a principal agent sense, as, you know, is this basically firms which are sort of doing the bidding of states, or is it the other way around, that states are hypersensitive to what the firms want? And you know, there's really sort of good examples in the literature of when those assumptions break down, right? Or when you have divergence between what the firms want and what the states want, and in unpredictable ways as well, because sometimes it's the firms that push for transnational procurement, right? Because they'll benefit from efficiencies. Other times it's the member state governments that are keener to do that, and the firms are really concerned about the risk of sort of you know, transferring information through these collaborative projects and not getting anything out of it. But thank you so much, Thomas, for all your helpful comments. It's given us a lot to think about. And Brexit, yeah. It is. So yeah, so I think we haven't covered Brexit in the paper. I tried to put it in the presentation a little bit. We depict it as a kind of enabling factor. So yes, there is push for a kind of EU defence industrial base post Brexit. I guess you also run up against I think two questions. One is whether or not, one is the return of this kind of thorny question about, is it an EU defence industrial base, or is it a European defence industrial base? And if it's a European defence industrial base that can somehow sort of combine the clout of the United Kingdom, then you have a much stronger, much more competitive sort of environment. And I guess the other question there is how distinct the preferences of the UK are, whether the UK is at all interested in collaborating in some of these projects. So I think that EU, well, precisely, right, but is also, so is distinct not just because of I guess it's twofold. It's the fact that the UK has been the UK government has been a much more kind of liberal actor in this regard, pushing for greater liberalization, which introduces a sort of more political schism, but also the transatlantic sort of politics of that as well, where it's also, I mean, one of the consequences of that, of British sort of liberal view of this, is they've also been happy to buy from the Americans, even at the expense of their own defense industry. So I think there's a lot of big political questions wound up in that, but it's something that's on our mind. It might be a separate paper maybe down the line. Thanks.
Separate paper for the special issue, you mean?
That's a bit fine.
I mean, as long as we know it beforehand, that'll be fine. Okay, thanks again. Professor Fabrini, you want to reply to Thomas' comments?
I don't want to abuse of your resilience, because
that's fine.
You have the lunch waiting for you. Yes, I do agree completely with Thomas that the distinction between sovereignty and capability-based differentiation is probably at the origin, is the cause of this differentiation in governance regime, but it's difficult to stand. However, that is part of the discussion on the European Union, because the differentiation of governance regime is dealing continuously with formidable challenges and constraints. Who decide the foreign policy or the defense policy, and who take care of the building of the industry necessary for implementing the foreign policy. This division is always there. It's called the SOFA question. When the President of the Commission, the President of the European Council went to visit Erdogan, and each of them claimed to be representative of that division, but none of them is able to bridge that division. So, okay, this is more an empirical question to understand the policy for policy, but you raised the issue that that division is no longer viable, or at least cannot be organized within that institutional framework. Thanks a lot again.
Right, thank you very much. I think we can now not entirely close the session. Now back to the logistics, I would say. So if Ilke, if you want to leave, thank you for your contribution. Thank you for being here with us. and for the great comments and inputs. And I hope to see you in person here, maybe at the UI at some point again. Professor Fabrini, I don't know whether you want to say, but again, depends very much on whether you're interested in on the logistics of our next steps for the special issue. Maybe he left already. No, he's there. Okay, right. Okay, I'll be quick and efficient because I mean we all deserve it. Step one. I think these 2 days have been quite enriching, but also they have been also challenging. So I would say both rewarding and challenging, meaning that me and Monica will certainly have to put our heads together in the coming days, weeks, hopefully not months, but we'll certainly work on a common conceptual framework. And as you know, special issues generally include 8 to 10 papers, which means that we will probably not be able to accommodate everything. And with everything, I mean all the all-encompassing and wide range topics that came out during these days, and especially concepts. So we'll do our best. But what we aim at doing certainly is to cover the formal and informal dimension of differentiation, both from an internal and external perspective. Having said that, within this, let's say, 4-dimensional structure, we will try to include everything that came out, but certainly we also have to do a bit of streamlining in terms of efficiency, and with efficiency I mean in terms of clearness of our conceptual framework, to avoid the minestrone, given that minestrone together with conceptual stretching is another thread of the 2 days workshop, the minestrone effect in the special issue. What we will do in practical terms is to get back to you with an email containing both the common conceptual framework and some suggestions on our side, from our side, on how we think that your paper might fit into it. Obviously, you're free to listen, not to listen, or to actually complement what you will be doing with our inputs. That will be just our let's say our support to you. And I will now give the floor to Monica, who will talk about the steps following the revisions of your paper.
I mean, very briefly, and just building up on what Maria Giulia has just said, I mean, we've all been involved in special issues before, certainly, so we will have to do some sacrifices, you know that, right? I mean, we have to keep the framework coherent. I mean, first of all, we have to come up with the framework, and then we will have to talk to all of you in order to see whether the papers will fit into the framework or not. Hopefully they will fit, but I think, you know, it's a process that we will have to some extent, you know, be engaged all together and see whether it's a good fit or not. And we thought that we will need quite some time to develop the framework. I mean, not months probably, but I think it's realistic to say that we will have the framework ready by Christmas. Hopefully, right? And then we will get in touch with you probably in the beginning of January, and then talk to you individually about the deadlines and, you know, the next steps, kind of. There are quite a couple of journals that we aim to approach. I just dropped 4 names, but please don't take my word for now, but we are thinking about approaching Western European politics, JEP, the Journal of Common Market Studies, and obviously Journal of European Integration. Hi, Thomas. But we have to see whether, whether there are calls for special issues open, and how much time will it take to get it published, since we hope that by sometime in spring we'll have all papers ready. So probably that will be the moment when we will approach the journals. But again, it's something that we will definitely want to talk with you about in the incoming months and weeks. And
I'm sorry, Monica, obviously if you have any ideas, please feel free to drop them and yes, to discuss that with us, either now or in the future, concerning the journal that we could be approaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, also the framework, it's a two-way street, right? So we'll propose something and we'll really try hard to make it work. We also talked to Stephanie in the meantime, and she's also ready to, you know, help us out with that. We will certainly come up with the glossary, because we see that we really need it. I think we all need it, right? And let's keep talking about that, basically. I mean, we'll of course make the first step and the first approach, and then we count on your feedback. And I think, having said that, there is nothing more to say except that, and I think I speak on behalf of both of us. We are really grateful for you that you came here and that you brought us with a lot of ideas and papers and empirics and concepts. And I think there is one thing that we are certainly can say that we are definitely not short of concepts. I think that's quite the opposite problem that we now have, but that's for us to deal with that for the time being. So thank you so much. I think it was a really nice workshop. I enjoyed it a lot. I hope you too. And let's have lunch.